And then there is Esther Summerson, the heroine introduced in Chapter 3, the shy but strong orphan girl, whose story links all the characters. The omniscient narrator seldom displays emotion other than anger. He describes the action, but as above. Esther, on the other hand, is full of emotion. She is a feeling creature. Some critics find her disingenuous and sentimental. Dickens was most anxious to give her a separate voice from the storyteller, and I must do the same. She does have a distinct character, but sometimes he allows her disingenuousness to slip, describing her doll, the one comfort of her childhood life. She writes, and so she used to sit propped up in a great armchair, with her beautiful complexion and rosy lips, staring at me, or not so much at me, I think, as at nothing. That parenthesis is the giveaway. It's to consciously observant. If I'm honest, I don't really warm to Esther, but her loving nature ultimately makes me forgive her. She's yet another of those young women of whom Dickens was so fond, always little shrinking violets, more child than woman. But if Bleak House were only Esther's story, it wouldn't engage us, as it does. It is rather the story of England in the 19th century, dissecting the class divide, the absurdities of the legal system, and the crass cruelty of snobbery. England is fortunate in still having regional and class accents, which Dickens accords a dialogue seized in the service of character, from Wales, from London through Hertfordshire, Birmingham up to Lincolnshire. The accurate dialects crowd in upon each other. The whole country is mine for its varieties. For the reader, it's a real test of holding a voice in your head. For the listener, it helps to fix the character and understand the journey through the land that Dickens takes us on. Class is always part of a Dickens novel. It underpins our society still in the 19th century. It was omnipotent, and fierce. Bleak House characters are firmly placed in their class prison, and when Dickens juxtaposes the two, the Rouncewells becoming essential to the Baronet Sylvester Dedlock, he never forgets they cannot be equal, but their common humanity should overcome the chasm which separates them. Dickens was himself a snob, always wanting to be thought a gentleman, but never quite making it. People remarked on his over-danified dress. In the 1841 census, he described himself as gentleman. In the 1851 census, he was Charles Dickens' author. And when towards the end of his life, after a performance at Buckingham Palace, Queen Victoria offered him an audience, a most prized honor, he was nevertheless expected to stand throughout the meeting. This offended his sense of himself, which had always been highly developed. Even as a little boy, he was outraged that his parents allowed his gifted musical sister Fanny to continue her studies at the Royal Academy, whilst he was sent to work in the blacking factory. But Dickens, a real artist, transmuted the chip on his shoulder into penetrating analyses of the world around him. Bleak House has one of the most complicated of his plots. It is mystifying to me how he managed to hold all the elements in his head, using the most majestic prose to weave the tapestry of his story into a seamless whole. Spoiler alert: the death of Joe the crossing sweeper is mirrored by the death of Esther's mother. The high and the lowly of the land meet the same fate in the same place. How can they be so closely connected? The narrative structure of the book makes it hard for the reader. I have to switch instantly between my two narrative voices. This is thrilling for the listener, I hope, but daunting for me. And towards the end, as the threads are bound together, my hardest task is to read through my tears. The emotional power of a Dickens novel has to be resisted. It's not my tears which matter, it's yours. So the immense simplicity of it was my mother cold and dead is surprisingly hard to utter. I choke with sobs in many places. Retakes are essential. Perhaps you would care to know what happens when an audiobook is read. Some read from iPads. I cannot do that. I have to have a printed unbound text which I prepare the night before, making sure that a page turn doesn't interrupt the flow. Bleak House took 3 weeks to record, spaced over some time. The studio is a small room. I sit at a desk. I turn off the air conditioning and I place the sheets on the lectern. I must not move, barely breathe, and my director and my engineer sit in the glass booth in front of me, listening for every error and interfering noise which could spoil a listener's pleasure. When I make mistakes, blow my nose, or bang the microphone, there's a command from the headphones, and we reset and begin the phrase again. It is a rigorous discipline, and without my director Garrick Hagan, I could not do it. Bleak House is a long book, and I hope that my recording will whet your appetite to read it for yourselves. Dickens wrote in scenes. He places you in the world of his imagination. He coaxes you through murder, through jealousy, through greed, snobbery, cruelty, finally through love in all its facets. he makes you laugh and cry and wonder, are you sitting comfortably? Let us begin. Authors. Preface. A Chancery judge once had the kindness to inform me, as one of a company of some 150 men and women not laboring under any suspicions of lunacy, that the Court of Chancery, though the shining subject of much popular prejudice, at which point I thought the judges I had a cast in my direction, was almost immaculate, there had been, he admitted, a trivial blemish or so in its rate of progress. But this was exaggerated, and had been entirely owing to the parsimony of the public, which guilty public it appeared had been until lately bent in the most determined manner on by no means enlarging the number of chancery judges appointed, I believe, by Richard II, but any other king will do as well. This seemed to me too profound a joke to be inserted in the body of this book, or I should have restored it to Conversation Kenji, or to Mr. Vowles, with one or other of whom I think it must have originated in such mouths. I might have coupled it with an apt quotation from one of Shakespeare's sonnets: my nature is subdued to what it works in, like the dyer's hand. Pity me then, and wish I were renewed. But as it is wholesome that the parsimonious public should know what has been doing and still is doing in this connection, I mention here that everything set forth in these pages concerning the Court of Chancery is substantially true, and within the truth the case of Gridley is in no essential altered from one of actual occurrence made public by a disinterested person who was professionally acquainted with the whole of the monstrous wrong from beginning to end at the present moment. August 1853. There is a suit before the court which was commenced nearly 20 years ago, in which from 30 to 40 counsel have been known to appear at one time, in which costs have been incurred to the amount of £70,000, which is a friendly suit, and which is, I am assured, no nearer to its termination now than when it was begun. There is another well-known suit in Chancery not yet decided, which was commenced before the close of the last century, and in which more than double the amount of £70,000 has been swallowed up in costs. If I wanted other authorities for John Dyer and John Dyer, I could rain them on these pages to the shame of a parsimonious public. There's only one other point on which I offer a word of remark. The possibility of what is called spontaneous combustion has been denied since the death of Mr. Crook, and my good friend Mr. Lewis quite mistaken, as he soon found, in supposing the thing to have been abandoned by all authorities, published some ingenious letters to me at the time when that event was chronicled, arguing that spontaneous combustion could not possibly be. I have no need to observe that I do not willfully or negligently mislead my readers, and that before I wrote that description, I took pains to investigate the subject. There are about 30 cases on record, of which the most famous, that of the Countess Cornelia Debot Chesnanate, was minutely investigated and described by Giuseppe Bianchi, a prebendary of Verona, otherwise distinguished in letters, who published an account of it at Verona in 1731, which he afterwards republished at Rome. The appearances beyond all rational doubt observed in that case are the appearances observed in Mr. Crook's case. The next most famous instance happened at Reims 6 years earlier, and the historian in that case is Lecker, one of the most renowned surgeons produced by France. The subject was a woman whose husband was ignorantly convicted of having murdered her, but on solemn appeal to a higher court he was acquitted, because it was shown upon the evidence that she had died the death of which this name of spontaneous combustion is given. I do not think it necessary to add to these notable facts, and that general reference to the authorities will be found in Chapter 33, the recorded opinions and experiences of distinguished medical professors, French, English, and Scotch, in more modern days, contenting myself with observing that I shall not abandon the facts until there shall have been a considerable spontaneous combustion of the testimony on which human occurrences are usually received. In Bleak House I have purposely dwelt upon the romantic side of familiar things. I believe I have never had so many readers as in this book. May we meet again. London, August 1853. Chapter 1. In Chancery, London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall. Implacable November weather, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth, and it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill, smoke lowering down from chimney pots, making a soft black drizzle with flakes of soot in it as big as full-grown snowflakes gone into mourning, one might imagine, for the death of the sun. Dogs undistinguishable in mire, horses scarcely better splash, to their very blinkers foot passengers, jostling one another's umbrellas in a general infection of ill temper, and losing their foothold at street corners where tens of thousands of other foot passengers have been slipping and sliding since the day broke. If this day ever broke, adding new deposits to the crust upon crust of mud sticking at those points tenaciously to the pavement and accumulating at compound interest fog everywhere, fog up the river where it flows among green nadies and meadows, fog down the river where it rolls defiled among the tears of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city, fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of Collier Briggs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog dropping on the gunners of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little apprentice boy on deck, chance people on the bridges peeping over the parapets into a nether sky of fog, with fog all round them as if they were up in a balloon, and hanging in the misty clouds, gas looming through the fog in diverse places in the streets, much as the sun may from the spongy fields be seen to loom by husbandman and ploughboy, most of the shops lighted 2 hours before their time, as the gas seems to know, for has a haggard and unwilling look. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation Temple Bar, and hard by Temple Bar in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. Never can there come fog too thick, never can there come mud and mire too deep to assault with a groping and floundering condition, which this High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth on such an afternoon. If ever the Lord High Chancellor ought to be sitting, here he is, with a foggy glory round his head, softly fenced in with crimson cloth and curtains, addressed by a large advocate with great whiskers, a little voice, and an interminable brief, and outwardly directing his contemplation to the lantern in the roof, where he can see nothing but fog on such an afternoon. Some score of members of the High Court of Chancery Bar ought to be, as here they are, mistily engaged in one of the 10,000 stages of an endless cause, tripping one another up on slippery precedents, groping knee-deep in technicalities, running their goat hair and horsehair warded heads against walls of words, and making a pretense of equity with serious faces, as players might on such an afternoon. The various solicitors in the cause, some 2 or 3 of whom have inherited it from their fathers, who made a fortune by it, ought to be, as are they not, ranged in a line, in a long matted well, but you might look in vain for truth at the bottom of it, between the registrar's red table and the silk gowns with bills, cross bills, answers, rejoinders, injunctions, affidavits, issues, references to masters' reports, mountains of costly nonsense piled before them. Well may the court be dim with wasting candles here, and there well may the fog hang heavy in it as if it would never get out. Well may the stained glass windows lose their color and admit no light of day into the place. Well may the uninitiated from the streets who peep in through the glass pane and the door be deterred from entrance by its owlish aspect, and by the drawl languidly echoing to the roof from the padded dais where the Lord High Chancellor looks into the lantern that has no light in it, and where the attendant wigs are all stuck in a fog bank. This is the Court of Chancery, which has its decaying houses and its blighted lands in every shire, which has its worn-out lunatic in every madhouse and its dead in every churchyard, which has its ruined suitor with his slipshod heels and threadbare dress borrowing and begging through the round of every man's acquaintance, which gives to moneyed might the means abundantly of wearying out the right, which so exhausts finances, patience, courage, hope, so overthrows the brain and breaks the heart, that there is not an honorable man among its practitioners who would not give, who does not often give the warning, suffer any wrong that can be done you, rather than come here, who happen to be in the Lord Chancellor's court this murky afternoon. Besides the Lord Chancellor, the counsel in the course, 2 or 3 counsel, who are never in any course, and the well of solicitors before mentioned. There is the registrar below, the judge in wig and gown, and there are 2 or 3 maces, or petty bags, or privy purses, or whatever they may be, in legal court suits. These are all yawning, for no crumb of amusement ever falls from John Dale and John Dale, the cause in Hamp, which was squeezed dry years upon years ago, the shorthand writers, the reporters of the court, and the reporters of the newspapers invariably decamp with the rest of the regulars when John Dice and John Dice, commies on their places, are a blank standing on a seat at the side of the hall. The better to peer into the curtained sanctuary is a little mad old woman in a squeezed bonnet, who is always in court from its sitting to its rising, and always expecting some incomprehensible judgment to be given in her favor. Some say she really is or was a party to a suit, but no one knows for certain, because no one cares. She carries some small litter in a reticule, which she calls her documents, principally consisting of paper matches and dry lavender. A sallow prisoner has come up in custody for the half-dozenth time to make a personal application to purge himself of his contempt, which being a solitary surviving executor, who has fallen into a state of conglomeration about accounts of which it is not pretended that he had ever any knowledge, he is not at all likely ever to do. In the meantime, his prospects in life are ended. Another ruined suitor who periodically appears from Shropshire and breaks out into efforts to address the Chancellor at the close of the day's business, and who can by no means be made to understand that the Chancellor is legally ignorant of his existence after making it desolate for a quarter of a century, plants himself in a good place, and keeps an eye on the judge, ready to call out "my lord" in a voice of sonorous complaint on the instant of his rising. A few lawyers, clerks, and others who know the suitor by sight linger on the chance of his furnishing some fun and enlivening the dismal weather. A little Jandice and Jandice drones on this scarecrow of a suit has in course of time become so complicated that no man alive knows what it means. The parties to it understand at least, but it has been observed that no two Chancery lawyers can talk about it for 5 minutes without coming to a total disagreement as to all the premises. Innumerable children have been born into the cause, innumerable young people have married into it, innumerable old people have died out of it, scores of persons have deliriously found themselves made parties in John Dyer and John Dyer without knowing how or why. Whole families have inherited legendary hatreds with the suit. The little plaintiff or defendant who was promised a new rocking horse when John Dacey and John Dacey should be settled has grown up, possessed himself of a real horse, and trotted away into the other world. Fair wards of court have faded into mothers and grandmothers. A long procession of chancellors has come in and gone out. The legion of bills in the suit have been transformed into mere bills of mortality. There are not 3 John Dices left upon the earth, perhaps since old Tom John Dice in despair blew his brains out at a coffee house in Chancery Lane. But John Dice and John Dice still drags its dreary length before the court. Perennially hopeless, John Dice and John Dice has passed into a joke that is the only good that has ever come of it. It has been death to many, but it is a joke in the profession. Every master in Chancery has had a reference out of it. Every chancellor was in it for somebody or other when he was counsel at the bar. Good things have been said about it by blue-nosed bulbous old benchers in select port wine committee after dinner in hall. Article clerks have been in the habit of flashing their legal wit upon it. The last Lord Chancellor handled it neatly when correcting Mr. Blowers, the eminent silk gown, who said that such a thing might happen when the sky rained potatoes. He observed, or when we get through John Dacey and John Dacey, Mr. Blowers, a pleasantry that particularly tickled the maces, bags, and purses. How many people out of the suit Jandice and Jandice has stretched forth its unwholesome hand to spoil and corrupt would be a very wide question from the master upon whose impaling files reels of dusty warrants and Jandice have grimly writhed into many shapes, down to the copying clerk in the 6 clerk's office, who has copied his tens of thousands of Chancery folio pages under that eternal heading. No man's nature has been made better by it in trickery, evasion, procrastination, spoliation, botheration, under false pretenses of all sorts. There are influences that can never come to good. The very solicitors' boys who have kept the wretched suitors at bay by protesting time out of mind that Mr. Chisel-Mizzle or otherwise was particularly engaged and had appointments until dinner may have got an extra moral twist and shuffle into themselves out of John Dice's, and John Dice's, the receiver in the cause, has acquired a goodly sum of money by it, but has acquired to a distrust of his own mother and a contempt for his own kind. Chisel-Mizzle and otherwise have lapsed into a habit of vaguely promising themselves that they will look into that outstanding little matter and see what can be done for Drizzle, who was not well used when John Dice and John Dice shall be got out. Of the office shirking and shocking in all their many varieties, have been sown broadcast by the ill-fated cause, and even those who have contemplated its history from the outermost circle of such evil have been insensibly tempted into a loose way of letting bad things alone, to take their own bad course, and a loose belief that if the world go wrong it was in some offhand manner never meant to go right. Thus in the midst of the mud, and at the heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor. In his High Court of Chancery, Mr. Tangle says the Lord High Chancellor lastly something restless, under the eloquence of that learned gentleman blood, says Mr. Tangle. Mr. Tangle knows more of John Dacey, and John Dacey than anybody. He is famous for it. Suppose never to have read anything else since he left school. Have you nearly concluded your argument? But not yet. Variety of points. I feel it my duty to submit. Bloodship is the reply that slides out of Mr. Dangle. Several members of the bar are still to be heard, I believe, says the Chancellor with a slight smile. 18 of Mr. Tangle's learned friends, each armed with a little summary of 18 sheets, bob up like 18 hammers in a piano fort, make 18 bows, and drop into their 18 places of obscurity. We will proceed with the hearing on Wednesday fortnight, says the Chancellor, for the question to issue is only a question of costs, a mere bud on the forest tree of the parent suit, and really will come to a settlement. One of these days the Chancellor rises, the bar rises, the prisoner is brought forward in a hurry. The man from Shropshire cries, "My Lord Macy's bags and purses," indignantly proclaims silence, and frown at the man from Shropshire. In reference proceeds the Chancellor still on John Dice and John Dice to the young girl, "Bagel chips." Pardon, boy, says Mr. Tangle prematurely. In reference proceeds the Chancellor with extra distinctness to the young girl and boy, the two young people Mr. Tangle crushed, whom I directed to be in attendance today, and who are now in my private room. I will see them and satisfy myself as to the expediency of making the order for their residing with their uncle. Mr. Tangle on his legs again. Beg your pardon, did. With the Chancellor looking through his double eyeglass at the papers on his desk. Grandfather begs luncheons pardon. Victim of rash action brains. Suddenly a very little counsel with a terrific bass voice arises, fully inflated in the back settlements of the fog, and says, "Will your lordship allow me I appear for him? He is a cousin several times removed. I am not at the moment prepared to inform the court in what exact remove he is a cousin, but he is a cousin." Leaving this address delivered like a sepulchral message ringing in the rafters of the roof, the very little counsel drops, and the fog knows him no more. Everybody looks for him, nobody can see him. "I will speak with both the young people," says the Chancellor anew, "and satisfy myself on the subject of their residing with their cousin. I will mention the matter tomorrow morning when I take my seat." The Chancellor is about to bow to the bar when the prisoner is presented. Nothing can possibly come of the prisoner's conglomeration, but is being sent back to prison, which is soon done. The man from Shropshire ventures another remonstrative, "My lord," but the Chancellor, being aware of him, has dexterously vanished. Everybody else quickly vanishes to a battery of blue bags, is loaded with heavy charges of papers, and carried off by clerks. The little mad old woman marches off with her documents. The empty court is locked up. If all the injustice it has committed, and all the misery it has caused, could only be locked up with it, and the whole burnt away in a great funeral pyre, why so much the better for other parties than the parties in Johnston's and Johnston's. Chapter 2. In fashion, it is but a glimpse of the world of fashion that we want on this same miry afternoon. It is not so unlike the Court of Chancery, but that we may pass from the one scene to the other as the crow flies. Both the world of fashion and the Court of Chancery are things of precedent and usage. Oversleeping Rip Van Winkles, who have played at strange games through a deal of thundery weather. Sleeping beauties, whom the night will wake one day, when all the stopped spits in the kitchen shall begin to turn prodigiously. It is not a large world relatively even to this world of ours, which has its limits too, as your highness shall find when you have made the tour of it, and are come to the brink of the void. Beyond it is a very little speck. There is much good in it. There are many good and true people in it. It has its appointed place, but the evil of it is that it is a world wrapped up in too much jeweled cotton and fine wool, and cannot hear the rushing of the larger worlds, and cannot see them as they circle round the sun. It is a deadened world, and its growth is sometimes Unhealthy for want of air, my Lady Deadlock has returned to her house in town for a few days previous to her departure for Paris, where her ladyship intends to stay some weeks, after which her movements are uncertain. The fashionable intelligence says so for the comfort of the Parisians, and it knows all fashionable things to know things otherwise were to be unfashionable. My Lady Deadlock has been down at what she calls, in familiar conversation, her place in Lincolnshire. The waters are out in Lincolnshire. An arch of the bridge in the park has been sapped and sopped away. The adjacent low-lying ground for half a mile in breadth is a stagnant river with melancholy trees for islands in it, and a surface punctured all over. All day long with falling rain, my Lady Deadlock's place has been extremely dreary. The weather for many a day and night has been so wet that the trees seem wet through, and the soft loppings and prunings of the woodman's axe can make no crash or crackle as they fall. The dear-looking soaked leaf quagmires where they pass. The shot of a rifle loses its sharpness in the moist air, and its smoke moves in a tardy little cloud towards the green rise coppice-topped that makes a background for the falling rain. The view from my Lady Deadlock's own windows is alternately a lead-colored view and a view in Indian ink. The vases on the stone terrace in the foreground catch the rain all day, and the heavy drops fall drip-drip upon the broad flag pavement called from old time. The ghosts walk all night on Sundays. The little church in the park is moldy. The oaken pulpit breaks out into a cold sweat, and there is a general smell and taste as of the ancient Deadlocks in their graves. My Lady Deadlock, who is childless, looking out in the early twilight from her boudoir at a keeper's lodge, and seeing the light of a fire upon the latticed panes and smoke rising from the chimney, and a child chased by a woman running out into the rain to meet the shining figure of a wrapped-up man coming through the gate, has been put quite out of temper. My Lady Deadlock says she has been bored to death. Therefore my Lady Deadlock has come away from the place in Lincolnshire, and has left it to the rain and the crows and the rabbits and the deer and the partridges and pheasants. The pictures of the Deadlocks past and gone have seemed to vanish into the damp walls in mere loneliness of spirits, as the housekeeper has passed along the old rooms, shutting up the shutters, and when they will next come forth again, the fashionable intelligence, which like the fiend is omniscient of the past and present, but not the future, cannot yet undertake to say Celesta Deadlock is only a baronet, but there is no mightier baronet than he. His family is as old as the hills and infinitely more respectable. He has a general opinion that the world might get on without hills, but would be done up without Deadlocks. He would on the whole admit nature to be a good idea, a little low perhaps when not enclosed with a park fence, but an idea dependent for its execution on your great county families. He is a gentleman of strict conscience, disdainful of all littleness and meanness, and ready on the shortest notice to die any death you may please to mention, rather than give occasion for the least impeachment of his integrity. He is an honorable, obstinate, truthful, high-spirited, intensely prejudiced, perfectly unreasonable man. Sir Lester is 20 years full measure older than my lady. He will never see 65 again, nor perhaps 66, nor yet 67. He has a twist of the gout now and then, and walks a little stiffly. He is of a worthy presence, with his light gray hair and whiskers, his fine shirt, frill, his pure white waistcoat, and his blue coat with bright buttons always buttoned. He is ceremonious, stately, most polite on every occasion to my lady, and holds her personal attractions in the highest estimation. His gallantry to my lady, which has never changed since he courted her, is the one little touch of romantic fancy in him. Indeed, he married her for love. A whisper still goes about that she had not even family, howbeit Celeste had so much family that perhaps he had enough, and could dispense with any more, but she had beauty, pride, ambition, insolent resolve, and sense enough to portion out a legion of fine ladies. Wealth and station added to these soon floated her upward, and for years now my Lady Deadlock has been at the center of the fashionable intelligence, and at the top of the fashionable tree. How Alexander wept when he had no more worlds to conquer, everybody knows, or has some reason to know by this time, the matter having been rather frequently mentioned. My Lady Deadlock, having conquered her world, fell not into the melting, but rather into the freezing mood, an exhausted composure, a worn-out placidity, an equanimity of fatigue not to be ruffled by interest or satisfaction, are the trophies of her victory. She is perfectly well bred. If she could be translated to heaven tomorrow, she might be expected to ascend without any rapture. She has beauty still, and if it be not in its heyday, it is not yet in its autumn. She has a fine face originally of a character that would be rather called very pretty than handsome, but improved into classicality by the acquired expression of her fashionable state. Her figure is elegant, and has the effect of being tall, not that she is so, but that the most is made, as the Honorable Bob Stables has frequently asserted upon oath of all her points. The same authority observes that she is perfectly got up, and remarks in commendation of her hair especially that she is the best groomed woman in the whole stud. With all her perfections on her head, my Lady Dedlock has come up from her place in Lincolnshire, hotly pursued by the fashionable intelligence, to pass a few days at her house in town previous to her departure for Paris, where her ladyship intends to stay some weeks, after which her movements are uncertain. And at her house in town, upon this muddy, murky afternoon, presents himself an old-fashioned old gentleman, attorney at law and eke solicitor of the High Court of Chancery, who has the honor of acting as legal adviser of the Dedlocks, and has as many cast-iron boxes in his office with that name outside, as if the present baronet were a coin of the conjurer's trick, and were constantly being juggled through the whole set, across the hall, and up the stairs, and along the passages, and through the rooms, which are very brilliant in the season, and very dismal out of it. Fairyland to visit, but a desert to live in. The old gentleman is conducted by a mercury and powder to my lady's presence. The old gentleman is rusty to look at, but is reputed to have made good thrift out of aristocratic marriage settlements and aristocratic wills, and to be very rich. He is surrounded by a mysterious halo of family confidences, of which he is known to be the silent depository. There are noble mausoleums rooted for centuries in retired glades of parks, among the growing timber and the fern, which perhaps hold fewer noble secrets than walk abroad among men shut up in the breast of Mr. Tulkinghorn. He is of what is called the old school, a phrase generally meaning any school that never seems to have been young, and wears knee breeches tied with ribbons and gaiters or stockings. One peculiarity of his black clothes and of his black stockings, be they silk or worsted, is that they never shine. Mute, close, irresponsible to any glancing light. His dress is like himself. He never converses. When not professionally consulted, he is found sometimes speechless, but quite at home at corners of dinner tables in great country houses, and near doors of drawing rooms, concerning which the fashionable intelligence is eloquent, where everybody knows him, and where half the peerage stops to say, "How do you do, Mr. Tulkinghorn?" He receives these salutations with gravity, and buries them along with the rest of his knowledge. Celeste Dedlock is with my lady, and is happy to see Mr. Tulkinghorn. There is an air of prescription about him which is always agreeable to Celeste. He receives it as a kind of tribute. He likes Mr. Tulkinghorn's dress. There is a kind of tribute in that too. It is eminently respectable, and likewise in a general way retainer-like. It expresses, as it were, the steward of the legal mysteries, the butler of the legal cellar of the Dedlocks. Has Mr. Tulkinghorn any idea of this himself? It may be so, or it may not, but there is this remarkable circumstance to be noted in everything associated with my Lady Dedlock, as one of a class, as one of the leaders and representatives of her little world. She supposes herself to be an inscrutable being, quite out of the reach and ken of ordinary mortals, seeing herself in her glass, where indeed she looks so, yet every dim little star revolving about her, from her maid to the manager of the Italian opera, knows her weaknesses, prejudices, follies, haughtinesses, and caprices, and lives upon as accurate a calculation and as nice a measure of her moral nature as her dressmaker takes of her physical proportions. Is a new dress, a new custom, a new singer, a new dancer, a new form of jewelry, a new dwarf or giant, a new chapel, a new anything to be set up. There are differential people in a dozen callings whom my Lady Dedlock suspects of nothing but prostration before her. Who can tell you how to manage her as if she were a baby, who do nothing but nurse her all their lives, who, humbly affecting to follow, with profound subservience lead her, and her whole troop, after them, who in hooking one hook all, and bear them off as Lemuel Gulliver bore away the stately fleet of the majestic Lilliput. If you want to address our people, Circe, Blaze, and Sparkle the jewelers, meaning by our people Lady Dedlock, and the rest, you must remember that you are not dealing with the general public. You must hit our people in their weakest place, and their weakest place is such a place to make this article go down. Gentlemen, say Sheen, and gloss the mercers to their friends the manufacturers. You must come to us, because we know where to have the fashionable people, and we can make it fashionable. If you want to get this print upon the tables of my high connection, sir, says Mr. Sladeway the librarian. Or if you want to get this dwarf or giant into the houses of my high connection, sir, or if you want to secure to this entertainment the patronage of my high connections, he must leave it, if you please, to me, for I have been accustomed to study the leaders of my high connections, sir, and I may tell you without vanity that I can turn them round my finger, in which Mr. Slattery, who is an honest man, does not exaggerate at all. Therefore, while Mr. Tulkinghorn may not know what is passing in the Dedlock mind at present, it is very possible that he may. My lady's cause has been again before the Chancellor, has it, Mr. Tulkinghorn, says Celeste, giving him his hand. Yes, it has been on again today, Mr. Tulkinghorn replies, making one of his quiet bows to my lady, who is on a sofa near the fire, shading her face with a hand screen. It would be useless to ask, says my lady, with the dreariness of the place in Lincolnshire still upon her, whether anything has been done. Nothing that you would call anything has been done today, replies Mr. Tulkinghorn, nor ever will be, says my lady. Celeste has no objection to an interminable chancer suit. It is a slow, expensive British constitutional kind of thing, to be sure. He has not a vital interest in the suit in question, her pardon, which was the only property my lady brought him, and he has a shadowy impression that for his name, the name of Dedlock, to be in a cause and not in the title of that cause is a most ridiculous accident. But he regards the Court of Chancery, even if it should involve an occasional delay of justice and a trifling amount of confusion, as a something devised in conjunction with a variety of other somethings by the perfection of human wisdom, for the eternal settlement, humanly speaking, of everything. And he is upon the whole of a fixed opinion that to give the sanction of his countenance to any complaints respecting it would be to encourage some person in the lower classes to rise up somewhere, like what Tyler, as a few fresh affidavits have been put upon the file, says Mr. Tulkinghorn, and as they are short, and as I proceed upon the troublesome principle of begging leave to possess my clients with any new proceedings in a cause, cautious man, Mr. Tulkinghorn, taking no more responsibility than necessary. And further, as I see you are going to Paris, I have brought them in my pocket. Celeste was going to Paris, to by the by, but the delight of the fashionable intelligence was in his lady. Mr. Tulkinghorn takes out his papers, asks permission to place them on a golden talisman of a table at my lady's elbow, put on his spectacles, and begins to read by the light of a shaded lamp. Enchantress between John Jandis, my lady interrupts, requesting him to miss as many of the formal horrors as he can. Mr. Tulkinghorn glances over his spectacles and begins again. Lower down, my lady carelessly and scornfully abstracts her attention. Celeste, in a great chair, looks at the file and appears to have a stately liking for the legal repetitions and prolixities as ranging among the national bulwarks. It happens that the fire is hot where my lady sits, and that the hand screen is more beautiful than useful, being priceless, but small. My lady, changing her position, sees the papers on the table, looks at them nearer, still asks impulsively, "Who copied that?" Mr. Tulkinghorn stops short, surprised by my lady's animation and her unusual tone. "Is it what you people call your hand?" she asks, looking full at him in her careless way again, and toying with her screen. "Not quite, probably." Mr. Tulkinghorn examines it as he speaks. "The legal character which it has was acquired after the original hand was formed." "Why do you ask?" "Anything to vary this detestable monotony." "Oh, go on, do." Mr. Tulkinghorn reads again. "The heat is greater." My lady screams, her face. Celeste dozes, starts up suddenly, and cries, "What do you say?" "I say, I am afraid," says Mr. Tulkinghorn, who had risen hastily, "that Lady Dedlock is ill." "Faint," my lady murmurs with white lips. "Only that, but it is like the faintness of death." "Don't speak to me. Ring, and take me to my room." Mr. Tulkinghorn retires into another chamber. Bells ring, feet shuffle and patter. Silence ensues. Mercury at last begs Mr. Tulkinghorn to return. "Better now," quoth Celeste, motioning the lawyer to sit down and read to him alone. "Have been quite alarmed. I never knew my lady swoon before, but the weather is extremely trying, and she really has been bored to death down at our place in Lincolnshire." Chapter 3 A Progress. I have a great deal of difficulty in beginning to write my portion of these pages, for I know I am not clever. I always knew that. I can remember when I was a very little girl, indeed, I used to say to my doll when we were alone together, "Now, Dolly, I am not clever, you know very well, and you must be patient with me like a dear, and so she used to sit propped up in a great armchair with her beautiful complexion and rosy lips staring at me, or not so much at me I think as at nothing, while I busily stitched away and told her every one of my secrets. My dear old doll, I was such a shy little thing that I seldom dared to open my lips and never dared to open my heart to anybody else. It almost makes me cry to think what a relief it used to be to me when I came home from school of a day to run upstairs to my room and say, "Oh, you dear faithful dolly, I knew you would be expecting me," and then to sit down on the floor leaning on the elbow of her great chair and tell her all I had noticed since we parted. I had always rather a noticing way, not a quick way, oh no, a silent way of noticing what passed before me and thinking I should like to understand it better. I have not by any means a quick understanding. When I love a person very tenderly, indeed it seems to brighten. But even that may be my vanity. I was brought up from my earliest remembrance like some of the princesses in the fairy stories, only I was not charming by my godmother. At least I only knew her as such. She was a good woman. She went to church 3 times every Sunday, and 2 morning prayers on Wednesdays and Fridays, and to lectures whenever there were lectures, and never missed. She was handsome, and if she had ever smiled would have been, I used to think, like an angel. But she never smiled. She was always grave and strict. She was so very good herself. I thought that the badness of other people made her frown all her life. I felt so different from her, even making every allowance for the differences between a child and a woman. I felt so poor, so trifling, and so far off that I never could be unrestrained with her, no, could never even love her as I wished it. Made me very sorry to consider how good she was and how unworthy of her I was, and I used ardently to hope that I might have a better heart. And I talked it over very often with the dear old doll, but I never loved my godmother as I ought to have loved her, and as I felt I must have loved her if I had been a better girl. This made me, I dare say, more timid and retiring than I naturally was, and cast me upon Dolly as the only friend with whom I felt at ease. But something happened when I was still quite a little thing that helped it very much. I had never heard my mamma spoken of. I had never heard of my papa either. But I felt more interested about my mamma. I had never worn a black frock that I could recollect. I had never been shown my mamma's grave. I had never been told where it was, yet I had never been taught to pray for any relation. But my godmother, I had more than once approached this subject of my thoughts with Mrs. Rachel, our only servant, who took my light away when I was in bed. Another very good woman, but austere to me, and she had only said Esther good night and gone away and left me. Although there were 7 girls at the neighboring school where I was a day boarder, and although they called me Little Esther Somerset, I knew none of them at home. All of them were older than I, to be sure. I was the youngest there by a good deal, but there seemed to be some other separation between us besides that, and besides their being far more clever than I was, and knowing much more than I did. One of them, in the first week of my going to the school, I remember it very well, invited me home to a little party to my great joy, but my godmother wrote a stiff letter declining for me, and I never went out at all. It was my birthday. There were holidays at school on other birthdays, none on mine. There were rejoicings at home on other birthdays, as I knew from what I heard the girls relate to one another. There were none on mine. My birthday was the most melancholy day at home in the whole year. I have mentioned that, unless my vanity should deceive me, as I know it may, for I may be very vain, without suspecting it, though indeed I don't. My comprehension is quickened when my affection is, my disposition is very affectionate, and perhaps I might still feel such a wound if such a wound could be received more than once. With the quickness of that birthday, dinner was over, and my godmother and I were sitting at the table before the fire. The clock ticked, the fire clicked. Not another sound had been heard in the room or in the house for I don't know how long. I happened to look timidly up from my stitching across the table at my godmother, and I saw in her face, looking gloomily at me, it would have been far better, little Esther, that you had had no birthday, that you had never been born. I broke out crying and sobbing, and I said, "Oh dear God, mother, tell me, pray do tell me, did Mama die on my birthday?" "No," she returned, "ask me no more, child. Oh, do pray tell me something of her. Do now at last, dear godmother, if you please. What did I do to her? How did I lose her? Why am I so different from other children? And why is it my fault, dear godmother? No, 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 don't go away. Oh, speak to me." I was in a kind of fright beyond my grief, and I caught hold of her dress and was kneeling to her. She had been saying all the while, "Let me go." But now she stood still. Her darkened face had such power over me that it stopped me in the midst of my vehemence. I put up my trembling little hand to clasp hers, or to beg her pardon with what earnestness I might, but withdrew it as she looked at me, and laid it on my fluttering heart. She raised me, sat in her chair, and standing me before her, said slowly in a cold, low voice, I see her knitted brow and pointed finger, "Your mother, Esther, is your disgrace, and you were hers. The time will come, and soon enough, when you will understand this better, and will feel it too, as no one save a woman can. I have forgiven her, but her face did not relent the wrong she did to me, and I say no more of it, though it was greater than you will ever know, than anyone will ever know. But I, the sufferer for yourself, unfortunate girl, orphaned and degraded from the first of these evil anniversaries, pray daily that the sins of others be not visited upon your head. According to what is written, forget your mother, and leave all other people to forget her who will do her unhappy child that greatest kindness. Now go." She checked me, however, as I was about to depart from her, so frozen as I was, and added, "The submission, self-denial, diligent work are the preparations for a life begun with such a shadow on it. You are different from other children, Esther, because you were not born like them in common sinfulness and wrath. You are set apart." I went up to my room and crept to bed, and laid my doll's cheek against mine, wet with tears, and holding that solitary friend upon my bosom, cried myself to sleep. Imperfect as my understanding of my sorrow was, I knew that I had brought no joy at any time to anybody's heart, and that I was to no one upon earth what Dolly was to me. Dear, dear, to think how much time we passed alone together afterwards, and how often I repeated to the doll the story of my birthday, and confided to her that I would try as hard as ever I could to repair the fault I had been born with, of which I confessedly felt guilty and yet innocent, and would strive as I grew up to be industrious, contented, and kind-hearted, and to do some good to someone and win some love to myself, if I could. I hope it is not self-indulgent to shed these tears as I think of it. I am very thankful, I am very cheerful, but I cannot quite help their coming to my eyes there. I have wiped them away now, and can go on again properly. I felt the distance between my godmother and myself so much more after the birthday, and felt so sensible of filling a place in her house which ought to have been empty, but I found her more difficult of approach, though I was fervently grateful to her in my heart than ever. I felt in the same way towards my school companions. I felt in the same way towards Mrs. Rachel, who was a widow, and towards her daughter, of whom she was proud, who came to see her once a fortnight. I was very retired and quiet, and tried to be very diligent. One sunny afternoon, when I had come home from school, with my books and portfolio, watching my long shadow at my side, and as I was gliding upstairs to my room, as usual, my godmother looked out of the parlor door, and called me back. Sitting with her I found, which was very unusual indeed, a stranger, a portly, important-looking gentleman, dressed all in black, with a white cravat, large gold watch seals, a pair of gold eyeglasses, and a large seal ring upon his little finger. This, said my godmother in an undertone, is the child. Then she said in her naturally stern way of speaking, "This is Esther, sir." The gentleman put up his eyeglasses to look at me, and said, "Come here, my dear." He shook hands with me, and asked me to take off my bonnet, looking at me all the while. When I had complied, he said, "Ah," and afterwards, "Yes," and then taking off his eyeglasses and folding them in a red case, and leaning back in his armchair, turning the case about in his two hands, he gave my godmother a nod. Upon that my godmother said, "You may go upstairs, Esther," and I made him my curtsy, and left him. It must have been 2 years afterwards, and I was almost 14, when one dreadful night my godmother and I sat at the fireside. I was reading aloud, and she was listening. I had come down at 9 o'clock, as I always did, to read the Bible to her, and was reading from St. John, how our Savior stooped down, writing with his finger in the dust, when they brought the sinful woman to him. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself, and said unto them, "He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her." I was stopped by my godmother's rising, putting her hand to her head, and crying out in an awful voice from quite another part of the book, "Watch therefore, lest coming suddenly he find you sleeping. And what I say unto you, I say unto all, watch." In an instant, while she stood before me repeating these words, she fell down on the floor. Had no need to cry out. Her voice had sounded through the house, and been heard in the street. She was laid upon her bed. For more than a week she lay there, little altered, outwardly with her old handsome resolute frown that I so well knew carved upon her face many and many a time in the day, and in the night with my head upon the pillow by her, that my whispers might be plainer to her, I kissed her, thanked her, prayed for her, asked her for her blessing and forgiveness, entreated her to give me the least sign that she knew or heard me. No, her face was immovable to the very last, and even afterwards her frown remained unsoftened. On the day after my poor good godmother was buried, the gentleman in black with the white neckcloth reappeared. I was sent for by Mrs. Rachel, and found him in the same place as if he had never gone away. My name is Kenji, he said. You may remember it, my child, Kenji and Cowboy Lincoln's Inn. I replied that I remembered to have seen him once before. Pray be seated here near me. Don't distress yourself. It's of no use, Mrs. Rachel. I needn't inform you, who are acquainted with the late Miss Barbry's affairs, that her means die with her, and that this young lady, now her aunt, is dead. My aunt, sir, it is really of no use carrying on a deception when no object is to be gained by it, said Mr. Kenj smoothly. Aren't, in fact, though not in law. Don't distress yourself. Don't weep. Don't tremble, Mrs. Rachel. Our young friend has no doubt heard of the John Dice, and John Dice never, said Mrs. Rachel. Is it possible, pursued Mr. Kenj, putting up his eyeglasses. But our young friend, I beg you won't distress yourself. Never heard of John Dixon. John Dixon. I shook my head, wondering even what it was. Not of John Dice. And John Dice, said Mr. Kenj, looking over his glasses at me and softly turning the case about and about as if he were petting something. Not of one of the greatest chancery suits known. Not of John Dale. And John Dale, the in itself a monument of chancery practice, in which I would say every difficulty, every contingency, every masterly fiction, every form of procedure known in that court is represented over and over again. It is a course that could not exist out of this free and great country. I should say that the aggregate of costs in John Dyson, Mrs. Rachel, I was afraid he addressed himself to her, because I appeared inattentive, amounts at the present hour to from 60 to 70,000 pounds, said Mr. Kenj, leaning back in his chair. I felt very ignorant, but what could I do? I was so entirely unacquainted with the subject that I understood nothing about it even then. And she really never heard of the cause, said Mr. Kent. Surprising, Miss Barbary, sir, returned Mrs. Rachel, who is now among the seraphim. I hope so, I'm sure, said Mr. Kenj, politely wished Esther only to know what would be serviceable to her, and she knows from any teaching she has had here nothing more. Well, said Mr. Kenj, upon the whole very proper. Now, to the point, addressing me, Miss Barbary, your sole relation, in fact, that is, for I am bound to observe that in law you had none, being deceased, and it naturally not being to be expected that Mrs. Rachel. Oh dear, no, said Mrs. Rachel quickly. Quite so, assented Mr. Kenj, that Mrs. Rachel should charge herself with your maintenance and support. I beg you won't distress yourself. You are in a position to receive the renewal of an offer which I was instructed to make to Miss Barbara some 2 years ago, and which, though rejected then, was understood to be renewable under the lamentable circumstances that have since occurred. Now, if I vow that I represent in John Dyson, and otherwise a highly humane, but at the same time singular man, shall I compromise myself by any stretch of my professional caution, said Mr. Kenj, leaning back in his chair again and looking calmly at us both. He appeared to enjoy beyond everything the sound of his own voice. I couldn't wonder at that, for it was mellow and full and gave great importance to every word he uttered. He listened to himself with obvious satisfaction, and sometimes gently beat time to his own music with his head, or rounded a sentence with his hand. I was very much impressed by him even then, before I knew that he formed himself on the model of a great lord who was his client, and that he was generally called Conversation Kenj. Mr. Jardice, he pursued, being aware of the, I would say, desolate position of our young friend, offers to place her at a first-rate establishment where her education shall be completed, where her comfort shall be secured, where her reasonable wants shall be anticipated, where she shall be eminently qualified to discharge her duty in that station of life unto which it has pleased, shall I say, Providence, to call her. My heart was filled so full both by what he said and by his affecting manner of saying it, that I was not able to speak, though I tried. Mr. Jardice, he went on, makes no condition beyond expressing his expectation that our young friend will not at any time remove herself from the establishment in question without his knowledge and concurrence, that she will faithfully apply herself to the acquisition of those accomplishments upon the exercise of which she will be ultimately dependent, that she will tread in the paths of virtue and honor, and the so forth. I was still less able to speak than before. Now, what does our young friend say? Proceeded Mr. Kenny. Take time, take time. I paused for her reply, but take time with the destitute subject of such an offer. Tried to say I need not repeat what she did say. I could more easily tell, if it were worth the telling, what she felt, and will feel to her dying hour. I could never relate. This interview took place at Windsor, where I had passed, as far as I knew, my whole life. On that day week, amply provided with all necessaries, I left it inside the stagecoach for reading. Mrs. Rachel was too good to feel any emotion at parting, but I was not so good, and wept bitterly. I thought that I ought to have known her better after so many years, and ought to have made myself enough of a favorite with her to make her sorry. Then, when she gave me one cold parting kiss upon my forehead like a thaw-drop from the stone porch, it was a very frosty day. I felt so miserable and self-reproachful that I clung to her and told her it was my fault. I knew that she could say goodbye so easily. No, Esther, she returned, it is your misfortune. The coach was at the little lawn gate. We had not come out until we heard the wheels, and thus I left her with a sorrowful heart. She went in before my boxes were lifted to the coach roof and shut the door. As long as I could see the house, I looked back at it from the window. Through my tears, my godmother had left Mrs. Rachel all the little property she possessed, and there was to be a sale, and an old hearthrug with roses on it, which always seemed to me the first thing in the world I had ever seen, was hanging outside in the frost and snow a day or two before I had wrapped the dear old doll in her own shawl and quietly laid her. I am half ashamed to tell it, in the garden earth under the tree that shaded my old window. I had no companion left but my bird, and him I carried with me in his cage. When the house was out of sight, I sat with my bird cage in the straw, at my feet forward on the low seat, to look out of the high window, watching the frosty trees that were like beautiful pieces of spar, and the fields all smooth and white with last night's snow, and the sun so red, but yielding so little heat, and the ice dark like metal where the skaters and sliders had brushed the snow away. There was a gentleman in the coach who sat on the opposite seat, and looked very large in a quantity of wrappings, but he sat gazing out of the other window, and took no notice of me. I thought of my dead godmother of the night, when I read to her of her frowning so fixedly and sternly in her bed, of the strange place I was going to, of the people I should find there, and what they would be like, and what they would say to me, when a voice in the coach gave me a terrible start. It said, "What the devil are you crying for?" I was so frightened that I lost my voice, and could only answer in a whisper, "Me, sir," for of course I knew it must have been the gentleman in the quantity of wrappings, though he was still looking out of his window. "Yes, you," he said, turning round. "I didn't know I was crying, sir," I faltered. "But you are," said the gentleman. "Look here." He came quite opposite to me from the other corner of the coach, brushed one of his large furry cuffs across my eyes, but without hurting me, and showed me that it was wet there. "Now you know you are," he said, "don't you?" "Yes, sir," I said. "And what are you crying for?" said the gentleman. "Don't you want to go there, sir?" "Why, wherever you are going," said the gentleman. "I am very glad to go there, sir," I answered. "Well, then look glad," said the gentleman. I thought he was very strange, or at least that what I could see of him was very strange, for he was wrapped up to the chin, and his face was almost hidden in a fur cap with broad fur straps at the side of his head fastened under his chin. But I was composed again, and not afraid of him. So I told him that I thought I must have been crying because of my godmother's death, and because of Mrs. Rachel's not being sorry to part with me. "Confound Mrs. Rachel," said the gentleman. "Let her fly away in a high wind on a broomstick." I began to be really afraid of him now, and looked at him with the greatest astonishment. But I thought that he had pleasant eyes, although he kept on muttering to himself in an angry manner and calling Mrs. Rachel names. After a little while he opened his outer wrapper, which appeared to me large enough to wrap up the whole coach, and put his arm down into a deep pocket in the side. "Now look here," he said, "in this paper, which was nicely folded, is a piece of the best plum cake that can be got for money, sugar on the outside, an inch thick like fat on mutton chops. Here's a little pie of gem. This is both for size and quality, made in France. And what do you suppose? It's made of livers of fat geese. How, there's a pie. Now let's see you eat 'em." "Thank you, sir," I replied. "Thank you very much indeed. But I hope you won't be offended, they are too rich for me. Flawed again, said the gentleman, which I didn't at all understand, and threw them both out of the window. He did not speak to me any more until he got out of the coach a little way short of reading, when he advised me to be a good girl and to be studious, and shook hands with me. I must say I was relieved by his departure. We left him at a milestone. I often walked past it afterwards, and never for a long time, without thinking of him and half expecting to meet him, but I never did, and so as time went on he passed out of my mind. When the coach stopped, a very neat lady looked up at the window and said, "Miss Donny." "No, ma'am, Mr. Somerset, that is." "Quite right," said the lady, Miss Donny. I now understood that she introduced herself by that name and begged Miss Donny's pardon for my mistake, and pointed out my boxes at her request under the direction of a very neat maid. They were put outside a very small green carriage, and then Miss Donny the maid and I got inside and were driven away. "Everything is ready for you, Esther," said Miss Donny, "and the scheme of your pursuit has been arranged in exact accordance with the wishes of your guardian, Mr. John Dice." "Did you say, ma, of your guardian, Mr. John Dice?" said Miss Donny. I was so bewildered that Miss Donny thought the cold had been too severe for me, and lent me her smelling bottle. "Do you know my guardian, Mr. John Dyson?" "Ma'am," I asked after a good deal of hesitation. "Not personally, Esther," said Miss Donny, "merely through his solicitors, Mrs. Kenyon, and Cowboy of London, a very superior gentleman, Mr. Kenyon, truly eloquent, indeed some of his periods quite majestic." I felt this to be very true, but was too confused to attend to it. Our speedy arrival at our destination, before I had time to recover myself, increased my confusion, and I never shall forget the uncertain and the unreal air of everything at Greenleaf, Miss Donny's house, that afternoon. But I soon became used to it. I was so adapted to the routine of Greenleaf before long that I seemed to have been there a great while, and almost to have dreamed rather than really lived my old life at my godmother's. Nothing could be more precise, exact, and orderly than Greenleaf. There was a time for everything all round the dial of the clock, and everything was done at its appointed moment. We were 12 boarders, and there were 2 Miss Donny's twins. It was understood that I would have to depend by and by on my qualifications as a governess, and I was not only instructed in everything that was taught at Greenleaf, but was very soon engaged in helping to instruct others, although I was treated in every other respect like the rest of the school. The single difference was made in my case from the first. As I began to know more, I thought more, and so in course of time I had plenty to do, which I was very fond of doing, because it made the dear girls fond of me at last. Whenever a new pupil came who was a little downcast and unhappy, she was so sure, indeed I don't know why, to make a friend of me, but all newcomers were confided to my care. They said I was so gentle, but I am sure they were. I often thought of the resolution I had made on my birthday to try to be industrious, contented, and true-hearted, and to do some good to someone and win some love if I could, and indeed I felt almost ashamed to have done so little and have won so much. I passed at Greenleaf 6 happy, quiet years. I never saw in any face that thank heaven on my birthday that it would have been better if I had never been born. When the day came round, it brought me so many tokens of affectionate remembrance that my room was beautiful with them from New Year's Day to Christmas. In those 6 years I had never been away except on visits at holiday time in the neighborhood. After the first 6 months or so I had taken Miss Donny's advice in reference to the propriety of writing to Mr. Kenj to say that I was happy and grateful, and with her approval I had written such a letter. I had received a formal answer acknowledging its receipt and saying we note the contents thereof, which shall be duly communicated to our client. After that I sometimes heard Miss Donny and her sister mention how regular my accounts were paid, and about twice a year I ventured to write a similar letter. I always received by return of post exactly the same answer in the same round hand, with the signature of Kenj and Carboy in another writing which I suppose to be Mr. Kang's. It seems so curious to me to be obliged to write all this about myself, as if this narrative were the narrative of my life, but my little body will soon fall into the background. Now 6 quiet years, I find I'm saying it for the second time, I had passed at Greenleaf, seeing in those around me, as it might be in a looking glass, every stage of my own growth and change. There when one November morning I received this letter, I omit the date, John Dice and John Dice, Old Square, Lincoln's Inn, Madam, our client Mr. John Dice being about to receive into his house, under an order of the Court of Chancery Award of the court in this cause, for whom he wishes to secure an eligible companion, directs us to inform you that he will be glad of your services in the aforesaid capacity. We have arranged for your being forwarded carriage free pair 8 o'clock coach from Reading on Monday morning next to White Horse Cellar, Piccadilly, London, where one of our clerks will be in waiting to convey you to our office as above. We are, Madam, your obedient servants, Kenge and Carboy, Miss Esther Somerset. Oh, never, never, never shall I forget the emotion this letter caused in the house. It was so tender of them to care so much for me. It was so gracious in that father who had not forgotten me to have made my often way so smooth and easy, and to have inclined so many youthful natures towards me, that I could hardly bear it. Not that I would have had them less sorry, I'm afraid not, but the pleasure of it, and the pain of it, and the pride and joy of it, and the humble regret of it were so blended that my heart seemed almost breaking while it was full of rapture. The letter gave me only 5 days' notice of my removal, when every minute added to the proofs of love and kindness that were given me in those 5 days. And when at last the morning came, and when they took me through all the rooms that I might see them for the last time, and when some cried, Esther dear, say goodbye to me here at my bedside, where you first spoke so kindly to me, and when others asked me only to write their names with Esther's love, and when they all surrounded me with their parting presents, and clung to me weeping, and cried, what shall we do when dear, dear Esther's gone? And when I tried to tell them how forbearing and how good they had all been to me, and how I blessed and thanked them every one, what a heart I had, and when the two Miss Donnies grieved as much to part with me as the least among them, and when the maid said, bless you, miss, wherever you go, and when the ugly lame old gardener, who I thought had hardly noticed me in all those years, came panting after the coach to give me a little nosegay of geraniums, and told me I had been the light of his eyes. Indeed, the old man said so. What a heart I had then, and could I help it if with all this, and the coming to the little school, and the unexpected sight of the poor children outside waving their hats and bonnets to me, and of a gray-haired gentleman and lady whose daughter I had helped to teach, and at whose house I had visited, who was said to be the proudest people in all that country, caring for nothing but calling out, goodbye, Esther, may you be very happy. Could I help it if I was quite bowed down in the coach by myself, and said, oh, I am so thankful, I am so thankful, many times over. But, of course, I soon considered that I must not take tears where I was going after all that had been done for me. Therefore, of course, I made myself sob less, and persuaded myself to be quiet by saying very often, Esther, now you really must, this will not do. I cheered myself up pretty well at last, though I'm afraid I was longer about it than I ought to have been, and when I had cooled my eyes with lavender water, it was time to watch for London. I was quite persuaded that we were there when we were 10 miles off, and when we really were there, that we should never get there. However, when we began to jolt upon a stone pavement, and particularly when every other conveyance seemed to be running into us, and we seemed to be running into every other conveyance, I began to believe that we really were approaching the end of our journey. Very soon afterwards, we stopped. A young gentleman who had inked himself by accident addressed me from the pavement, and said, I am from Kenge and Carboy's, Miss of Lincoln's Inn, if you please, sir, said I. He was very obliging, and as he handed me into a fly after superintending the removal of my boxes, I asked him whether there was a great fire anywhere, for the streets were so full of dense brown smoke that scarcely anything was to be seen. Oh dear no, miss, he said, this is a London particular. I had never heard of such a thing. A fog, miss, said the young gentleman. Oh indeed, said I. We drove slowly through the dirtiest and darkest streets that ever were seen in the world, I thought, and in such a distracting state of confusion that I wondered how the people kept their senses, until we passed into sudden quietude under an old gateway, and drove on through a silent square until we came to an odd nook in a corner where there was an entrance up a steep broad flight of stairs, like an entrance to a church. And there really was a churchyard outside, under some cloisters, for I saw the gravestones from the staircase window. This was Kenge and Carboy's. The young gentleman showed me through an outer office into Mr. Kenge's room, There was no one in it, and politely put an armchair for me by the fire. He then called my attention to a little looking glass hanging from a nail on one side of the chimney piece. In case you should wish to look at yourself, miss, after the journey, as you're going before the Chancellor. Not that it's requisite, I am sure, said the young gentleman civilly. Going before the Chancellor, I said, startled for a moment. Only a matter of form, miss, returned the young gentleman. Mr. Kenge is in court now. He left his compliments. And would you partake of some refreshment? There were biscuits and a decanter of wine on a small table, and look over the paper which the young gentleman gave me. As he spoke, he then stirred the fire and left me. Everything was so strange, the stranger from its being night in the daytime, the candles burning with a white flame and looking raw and cold. But I read the words in the newspaper without knowing what they meant, and found myself reading the same words repeatedly. As it was of no use going on in that way, I put the paper down, took a peep at my bonnet in the glass to see if it was neat, and looked at the room, which was not half lighted, and at the shabby dusty tables, and at the piles of writings, and at a bookcase full of the most inexpressive looking books that ever had anything to say for themselves. Then I went on thinking, and the fire went on burning, and the candles went on flickering and guttering, and there were no snuffers, until the young gentleman by brought a very dirty pair for 2 hours. At last Mr. Kenge came. He was not altered, but he was surprised to see how altered I was, and appeared quite pleased. As you are going to be the companion of the young lady who is now in the Chancellor's private room, Miss Summerson, he said, we thought it well that you should be in attendance. Also, you will not be discomposed by the Lord Chancellor. I dare say no, sir, I said. I don't think I shall, really, not seeing on consideration why I should be so. Mr. Kenge gave me his arm, and we went round the corner under a colonnade and in at a side door, and so we came along a passage into a comfortable sort of room where a young lady and a young gentleman were standing near a great loud roaring fire. A screen was interposed between them and it, and they were leaning on the screen talking. They both looked up when I came in, and I saw and the young lady with the fire shining upon her, such a beautiful girl, with such rich golden hair, such soft blue eyes, and such a bright, innocent, and trusting face. Miss Ada, said Mr. Kent, this is Miss Summerson. She came to meet me with a smile of welcome, and her hand extended, but seemed to change her mind in a moment, and kissed me. In short, she had such a natural, captivating, winning manner that in a few minutes we were sitting in the window seat with the light of the fire upon us, talking together as free and happy as could be. What a load off my mind! It was so delightful to know that she could confide in me, and like me, it was so good of her, and so encouraging to me. The young gentleman was her distant cousin, she told me, and his name Richard Carstone. He was a handsome youth with an ingenuous face and a most engaging laugh. And after she had called him up to where we sat, he stood by us in the light of the fire, talking gaily like a light-hearted boy. He was very young, not more than 19, then if quite so much, but nearly 2 years older than she was. They were both orphans, and what was very unexpected and curious to me, had never met before that day, our all three coming together for the first time in such an unusual place was a thing to talk about, and we talked about it, and the fire, which had left off roaring, winked its red eyes at us, as Richard said, like a drowsy old chancery lion. We conversed in a low tone, because a full-dressed gentleman in a bag wig frequently came in and out, and when he did so, we could hear a drawling sound in the distance, which he said was one of the council. In our case, addressing the Lord Chancellor, he told Mr. Kenge that the Chancellor would be up in 5 minutes, and presently we heard a bustle and a tread of feet, and Mr. Kenge said that the court had risen, and his lordship was in the next room. The gentleman in the bagwig opened the door almost directly, and requested Mr. Kenge to come in. Upon that, we all went into the next room. Mr. Kenge first with my darling. It is so natural to me now that I can't help writing it, and there, plainly dressed in black and sitting in an armchair at a table near the fire, was his lordship, whose robe trimmed with beautiful gold lace was thrown upon another chair. He gave us a searching look as we entered, but his manner was both courtly and kind. The gentleman in the bagwig laid bundles of papers on his lordship's table, and his lordship silently selected one and turned over the leaves. Miss Clare, said the Lord Chancellor. Miss Ada Clare. Mr. Kenge presented her, and his lordship begged her to sit down near him, that he admired her and was interested by her. Even I could see In a moment it touched me that the home of such a beautiful young creature should be represented by that dry official place. The Lord Chancellor at his best appeared so poor a substitute for the love and pride of parents that John Dice in question, said the Lord Chancellor, still turning over leaves, is John Dice of Bleak House. John Dice's of Bleak House, my lord, said Mr. Kenj. A dreary name, said the Lord Chancellor, but not a dreary place at present, my lord, said Mr. Kenj. And Bleak House, said his lordship, is in Hertfordshire. My lord, Mr. John Dice of Bleak House is not married, said his lordship. He is not, my lord, said Mr. Kenj. A pause. Young Mr. Richard Carstone is present, said the Lord Chancellor, glancing towards him. Richard bowed and stepped forward. Him, said the Lord Chancellor, turning over more leaves. Mr. John Dice in Bleak House, my lord, Mr. Kenj observed in a low voice, if I may venture to remind your lordship, provides a suitable companion for Mr. Richard Carstone, I thought, but I am not quite sure. I heard his lordship say in an equally low voice and with a smile from Miss Ada Clare, this is the young lady, Miss Somerset. His lordship gave me an indulgent look and acknowledged my curtsy very graciously. Miss Somerset is not related to any party in the cause, I think. No, my lord. Mr. Kenj leant over before it was quite said and whispered. His lordship, with his eyes upon his papers, listened, nodded twice or thrice, turned over more leaves, and did not look towards me again until we were going away. Mr. Kenj now retired, and Richard with him, to where I was near the door, leaving my pet. It is so natural to me that again I can't help it, sitting near the Lord Chancellor, with whom his lordship spoke a little part, asking her, as she told me afterwards, whether she had well reflected on the proposed arrangement, and if she thought she would be happy under the roof of Mr. John Dyson at Bleak House, and why she thought so. Presently he rose courteously and released her, and then he spoke for a minute or two with Richard Carstone, not seated, but standing, and altogether with more ease and less ceremony, as if he still knew, though he was Lord Chancellor, how to go straight to the candor of a boy. Very well, said his lordship aloud, I shall make the order Mr. John Dacey of Bleak House has chosen, so far as I may judge, and this was when he looked at me, a very good companion for the young lady, and the arrangement altogether seems the best of which the circumstances admit. He dismissed us pleasantly, and we all went out, very much obliged to him for being so affable and polite, by which he had certainly lost no dignity, but seemed to us to have gained some. When we got under the colonnade, Mr. Kenj remembered that he must go back for a moment to ask a question, and left us in the fog, with the Lord Chancellor's carriage and servants waiting for him to come out. Well, said Richard Carstone, that's over, and where do we go next, Miss Somerset? Don't you know? I said, not in the least, said he. And don't you know, my love? I asked. Ada, no, said she. Don't you? Not at all, said I. We looked at one another, half laughing at our being like the children in the wood, when a curious little old woman in a squeezed bonnet and carrying a reticule came curtsying and smiling up to us with an air of great ceremony. Oh, said she, the wards and John Dice, very happy, I am sure, to have the honor. It is a good omen for youth and hope and beauty when they find themselves in this place, and don't know what's to come of it. Mad, whispered Richard, not thinking she could hear him right. Mad, young gentleman, she returned so quickly that he was quite abashed. I was awarded myself I was not mad at that time, curtsying low and smiling between every little sentence. I had youth and hope, I believe beauty. It matters very little now. Neither of the three served or saved me. I have the honor to attend court regularly with my documents. I expect a judgment shortly on the day of judgment. I have discovered that the sixth seal mentioned in the Revelations is the Great Seal. It has been open a long time. Pray accept my blessing. As Ada was a little frightened, I said to humor the poor old lady that we were much obliged to her. Yes, she said mincingly, I imagine so. And here is conversation. Kenj with his documents. How does your honorable worship do? Ah, quite well, quite well. Now don't be troublesome. That's a good soul, said Mr. Kenj, leading the way back. By no means, said the poor old lady, keeping up with Ada and me. Anything but troublesome. I shall confer estates on both, which is not being troublesome. I trust. I expect a judgment shortly on the day of judgment. This is a good omen for you. Accept my blessing. She stopped at the bottom of the steep, broad flight of stairs, but we looked back as we went up, and she was still there, saying, still with a curtsy and a smile between every little Sentence youth, and hope and beauty and chancery and conversation Kenja pray accept my blessing chapter for telescopic philanthropy. We were to pass the night Mr. Kenj told us when we arrived in his room at Mrs. Jellyby's, and then he turned to me and said he took it for granted I knew who Mrs. Jellyby was. I really don't, sir, I returned. Perhaps Mr. Carstone or Miss Clare. But no, they knew nothing whatever about Mrs. Jellyby. Indeed, Mrs. Jellyby, said Mr. Kenj, standing with his back to the fire and casting his eyes over the dusty hearthrug, as if it were Mrs. Jellyby's biography, is a lady of very remarkable strength of character who devotes herself entirely to the public. She has devoted herself to an extensive variety of public subjects at various times, and is at present, until something else attracts her, devoted to the subject of Africa with a view to the general cultivation of the coffee berry and the natives, and the happy settlement on the banks of the African rivers of our superabundant home population. Mr. John Dice, who is desirous to aid any work that is considered likely to be a good work, and who is much sought after by philanthropists, has, I believe, a very high opinion of Mrs. Jellyby. Mr. Kenj, adjusting his cravat, then looked at us and Mr. Jedgley. Sir, suggested Richard. Mr. Jedgley, said Mr. Kenj, is, I don't know that I can describe him to you better than by saying that he is the husband of Mrs. Jedgley, a non-entity, sir, said Richard, with a droll look. I don't say that, returned Mr. Kenj gravely. I can't say that indeed, for I know nothing whatever of Mr. Jellyby. I never, to my knowledge, had the pleasure of seeing Mr. Jellyby. He may be a very superior man, but he is, so to speak, merged in the more shining qualities of his wife. Mr. Kenj proceeded to tell us that as the road to Bleak House would have been very long, dark, and tedious on such an evening, and as we had been traveling already, Mr. Jardice had himself proposed this arrangement. A carriage would be at Mrs. Jellyby's to convey us out of town early in the forenoon of tomorrow. He then rang a little bell, and the young gentleman came in. Addressing him by the name of Guppy, Mr. Kent inquired whether Miss Summerson's boxes and the rest of the baggage had been sent round. Mr. Guppy said yes, they had been sent round, and a coach was waiting to take us round to as soon as we pleased. Then it only remains, said Mr. Kent, shaking hands with us, for me to express my lively satisfaction and a good day, Miss Clare. The arrangement this day concluded, and my goodbye to you, Miss Somerset. Lively hope that it will conduce to the happiness. Glad to have had the honor of making your acquaintance, Mr. Carstone. Welfare, the advantage in all points of view of all concerned. Guppy, see the party safely there. Where is there, Mr. Guppy? Said Richard, as we went downstairs. No distance, said Mr. Guppy, round in Favors, and you know I can't say I know where it is, for I come from Winchester, and am strange in London. Only round a corner, said Mr. Guppy. We just twist up Chancery Lane and cut along Holborn, and there we are in for minutes. Time as near as a toucher. This is about a London particular, now ain't it, miss? He seemed quite delighted with it on my account. The fog is very dense indeed, said I. Not that it affects you, though, I'm sure, said Mr. Guppy, putting up the steps. On the contrary, it seems to do you good, miss. Judging from your appearance, I knew he meant well in paying me this compliment, so I laughed at myself for blushing at it when he had shut the door and got upon the box, and we all three laughed and chatted about our inexperience and the strangeness of London, until we turned up under archway to our destination, a narrow street of high houses like an oblong system to hold the fog. There was a confused little crowd of people, principally children, gathered about the house at which we stopped, which had a tarnished brass plate on the door with the inscription, "Jellyby, don't be frightened," said Mr. Guppy, looking in at the coach window. One of the young Jellybys been and got his head through the area railings. "Oh, poor child," said I. "Let me out, if you please. Pray be careful of yourself, miss. The young Jellybys are always up to something," said Mr. Guppy. I made my way to the poor child, who was one of the dirtiest little unfortunates I ever saw, and found him very hot and frightened and crying loudly, fixed by the neck between two iron railings, while a milkman and a beadle with the kindest intentions possible were endeavoring to drag him back by the legs, under a general impression that his skull was compressible by those means, as I found after pacifying him that he was a little boy with a naturally large head. I thought that perhaps where his head could go his body could follow, and mentioned that the best mode of extrication might be to push him forward. This was so favorably received by the milkman and beadle that he would immediately have been pushed into the area. If I had not held his pinafore while Richard and Mr. Guppy ran down through the kitchen to catch him. When he should be released at last, he was happily got down without any accident, and then he began to beat Mr. Guppy with a hoopstick in quite a frantic manner. Nobody had appeared belonging to the house except a person in patterns who had been poking at the child from below with a broom. I don't know with what object, and I don't think she did. I therefore suppose that Mrs. Jellyby was not at home, and was quite surprised when the person appeared in the passage, without the patterns, and going up to the back room on the first floor, before Adair and me announced us as them to young ladies Mrs. Jellyby. We passed several more children on the way up, whom it was difficult to avoid treading on in the dark, and as we came into Mrs. Jellyby's presence, one of the poor little things fell downstairs down a whole flight, as it sounded to me, with a great noise. Mrs. Jellyby, whose face reflected none of the uneasiness which we could not help showing in our own faces, as the dear child's head recorded its passage with a bump on every stair. Richard afterwards said he counted 7 besides 1, for the landing received us with perfect equanimity. She was a pretty, very diminutive, plump woman of from 40 to 50, with handsome eyes, though they had a curious habit of seeming to look a long way off, as if I am quoting Richard again. They could see nothing nearer than Africa. I am very glad indeed, said Mrs. Jellyby in an agreeable voice, to have the pleasure of receiving you. I have a great respect for Mr. Jardyce, and no one in whom he is interested can be an object of indifference to me. We expressed our acknowledgments, and sat down behind the door, where there was a lame invalid of a sofa. Mrs. Jellyby had very good hair, but was too much occupied with her African duties to brush at the shawl in which she had been loosely muffled dropped onto her chair when she advanced to us, and as she turned to resume her seat we could not help noticing that her dress didn't nearly meet up the back, and that the open space was railed across with a lattice work of stay lace, like a summer house. The room, which was strewn with papers and nearly filled by a great writing table covered with similar litter, was, I must say, not only very untidy, but very dirty. We were obliged to take notice of that with our sense of sight, even while with our sense of hearing we followed the poor child, who had tumbled downstairs, I think, into the back kitchen, where somebody seemed to stifle him. But what principally struck us was a jaded and unhealthy-looking, though by no means plain, girl at the writing table, who sat biting the feather of her pen and staring at us. I suppose nobody was ever in such a state of ink, and from her tumbled hair to her pretty feet, which were disfigured with frayed and broken satin slippers trodden down at heel, she really seemed to have no article of dress upon her from a pin upwards that was in its proper condition, or its right place. You find me, my dear, said Mrs. Jellyby, snuffing the 2 great office candles in tin candlesticks, which made the room taste strongly of hot tallow. The fire had gone out, and there was nothing in the grate but ashes. A bundle of wood and a poker. You find me, my dears, as usual, very busy, but that you will excuse the African project at present employs my whole time. It involves me in correspondence with public bodies and with private individuals anxious for the welfare of their species all over the country. I am happy to say it is advancing. We hope by this time next year to have from 150 to 200 healthy families cultivating coffee and educating the natives of Boriobula on the left bank of the Niger, as Ada said. Nothing but looked at me. I said, it must be very gratifying. It is gratifying, said Mrs. Jellyby. It involves the devotion of all my energies, such as they are. But that is nothing, so that it succeeds, and I am more confident of success every day. Do you know, Miss Amundsen, I almost wonder that you never turned your thoughts to Africa. This application of the subject was really so unexpected to me that I was quite at a loss how to receive it. I hinted that the climate, the finest climate in the world, said Mrs. Jellyby. Indeed, ma'am, certainly, with precaution, said Mrs. Jellyby. You may go into Hoban without precaution and be run over. You may go into Hoban with precaution and never be run over. Just so with Africa. I said, no doubt I meant as to Hoban, if you would like, said Mrs. Jellyby, putting a number of papers towards us to look over some remarks on that head and on the general subject, which has been extensively circulated, while I finish a letter I'm now dictating to my eldest daughter, who is my amanuensis. The girl at the table left off biting her pen and made a return to our recognition, which was half bashful and half sulky. I shall then have finished for the present, proceeded Mrs. Jellyby with a sweet smile, though my work is never done. "Where are you?" Caddy presents her compliments to Mr. Swallow, and Beggs said Caddy, and Beggs said Mrs. Jellyby, dictating to inform him in reference to his letter of inquiry on the African project. No PP not on my account. PP, so self-named, was the unfortunate child who had fallen downstairs, who now interrupted the correspondence by presenting himself with a strip of plaster on his forehead to exhibit his wounded knees, in which Ada and I did not know which to pity most, the bruises or the dirt. Mrs. Jellyby merely added with the serene composure with which she said, "Everything go along, you naughty peepee," and fixed her fine eyes on Africa again. However, as she at once proceeded with her dictation, and as I interrupted nothing by doing it, I ventured quietly to stop poor Peepee as he was going out, and to take him up to nurse. He looked very much astonished at it, and at Ada's kissing him, but soon fell fast asleep in my arms, sobbing at longer and longer intervals, until he was quiet. I was so occupied with Peepee that I lost the letter in detail, though I derived such a general impression from it of the momentous importance of Africa, and the utter insignificance of all other places and things, that I felt quite ashamed to have thought so little about it. 6 o'clock, said Mrs. Jellyby, and our dinner hour is nominally, for we dine at all hours. 5. Caddy, show Miss Clare and Miss Somerset their rooms. You'll like to make some change. Perhaps you will excuse me, I know, being so much occupied. Oh, that very bad child, pray put him down, Miss Summerson. I begged permission to retain him, truly saying that he was not at all troublesome, and carried him upstairs and laid him on my bed. Ada and I had to upper rooms with a door of communication between. They were excessively bare and disorderly, and the curtain to my window was fastened up with a fork. You would like some hot water, wouldn't you, said Miss Jellyby, looking round for a jug with a handle to it, but looking in vain. If it is not being troublesome, said we. Oh, it's not the trouble, returned Miss Jellyby. The question is if there is any. The evening was so very cold, and the rooms had such a marshy smell, that I must confess it was a little miserable, and Ada was half crying. We soon laughed, however, and were busily unpacking, when Miss Jellyby came back to say that she was sorry there was no hot water, but they couldn't find the kettle, and the boiler was out of order. We begged her not to mention it, and made all the haste we could to get down to the fire again, but all the little children had come up to the landing outside to look at the phenomenon of Peepee lying on my bed, and our attention was distracted by the constant apparition of noses and fingers in situations of danger between the hinges of the doors. It was impossible to shut the door of either room, for my lock, with no knob to it, looked as if it wanted to be wound up, and though the handle of Ada's went round and round with the greatest smoothness, it was attended with no effect whatever on the door. Therefore I proposed to the children that they should come in and be very good at my table, and I would tell them the story of Little Red Riding Hood while I dressed, which they did, and were as quiet as mice, including Peepee, who woke opportunely before the appearance of the Wolf. When we went downstairs, we found a mug with a present from Tunbridge Wells on it, lighted up in the staircase window with a floating wick, and a young woman with a swelled face bound up in a flannel bandage, blowing the fire of the drawing room, now connected by an open door with Mrs. Jellyby's room, and choking dreadfully. It smoked to that degree, in short, that we all sat coughing and crying with the windows open for half an hour, during which Mrs. Jellyby, with the same sweetness of temper, directed letters about Africa. Her being so employed was, I must say, a great relief to me, for Richard told us that he had washed his hands in a pie dish, and that they had found the kettle on his dressing table, and he made Ada laugh, so that they made me laugh in the most ridiculous manner. Soon after 7 o'clock we went down to dinner, carefully by Mrs. Jellyby's advice, for the stair carpets, besides being very deficient in stair wires, were so torn as to be absolute traps. We had a fine codfish, a piece of roast beef, a dish of cutlets, and a pudding, an excellent dinner, if it had had any cooking to speak of. But it was almost raw. The young woman with the flannel bandage waited and dropped everything on the table wherever it happened to go, and never moved it again until she put it on the stairs. The person I had seen in Patterns, who I supposed to have been the cook, frequently came and skirmished with her at the door, and there appeared to be ill will between them all through dinner, which was long in consequence of such accidents as the dish of potatoes being mislaid in the coal scuttle, and the handle of the corkscrew coming off and striking the young woman in the chin. Mrs. Jellyby preserved the evenness of her disposition. She told us a great deal that was interesting about Brio Bulow, and the natives, and received so many letters that Richard, who sat by her, saw for envelopes in the gravy at once. Some of the letters were proceedings of ladies' committees or resolutions of ladies' meetings, which she read to us. Others were applications from people excited in various ways about the cultivation of coffee and natives. Others required answers, and these she sent her eldest daughter from the table 3 or 4 times to write. She was full of business, and undoubtedly was, as she had told us, devoted to the cause. I was a little curious to know who a mild bald gentleman in spectacles was who dropped into a vacant chair. There was no top or bottom in particular after the fish was taken away, and seemed passively to submit himself to Barreau Bollinger, but not to be actively interested in that settlement, as he never spoke a word. He might have been a native, but for his complexion, it was not until we left the table, and he remained alone with Richard, that the possibility of his being Mr. Jelly ever entered my head. But he was Mr. Jalebi, and an eloquent young man called Mr. Quail, with large shining knobs for temples, and his hair all brushed to the back of his head, who came in the evening and told Ada he was a philanthropist. Also informed her that he called the matrimonial alliance of Mrs. Jellyby with Mr. Jellyby the union of mind and matter. This young man, besides having a great deal to say for himself about Africa, and a project of his for teaching the coffee colonists to teach the natives to turn piano-forte legs and establish an export trade, delighted in drawing Mrs. Jellyby out by saying, "I believe now, Mrs. Jellyby, you have received as many as from 150 to 200 letters respecting Africa in a single day, have you not? Or if my memory does not deceive me, Mrs. Jellyby, you once mentioned that you had sent off 5,000 circulars from one post office at one time," always repeating Mrs. Jellyby's answer to us like an interpreter. During the whole evening Mr. Jellyby sat in a corner with his head against the wall, as if he were subject to low spirits. It seemed that he had several times opened his mouth when alone with Richard after dinner, as if he had something on his mind, but had always shut it again, to Richard's extreme confusion, without saying anything. Mrs. Jellyby, sitting in quite a nest of waste paper, drank coffee all the evening and dictated at intervals to her eldest daughter. She also held a discussion with Mr. Quail, of which the subject seemed to be, if I understood it, the brotherhood of humanity, and gave utterance to some beautiful sentiments. I was not so attentive an auditor as I might have wished to be, however, for Peepee and the other children came flocking about Adair and me in a corner of the drawing room to ask for another story. So we sat down among them and told them in whispers Puss in Boots, and I don't know what else, until Mrs. Jellyby, accidentally remembering them, sent them to bed. As Peepee cried for me to take him to bed, I carried him upstairs, where the young woman with a flannel bandage charged into the midst of the little family like a dragon and overturned them into cribs. After that I occupied myself in making our room a little tidy, and in coaxing a very cross fire that had been lighted to burn, which at last it did quite brightly. On my return downstairs, I felt that Mrs. Jellyby looked down upon me rather for being so frivolous, and I was sorry for it, though at the same time I knew that I had no higher pretensions. It was nearly midnight before we found an opportunity of going to bed, and even then we left Miss Jellyby among her papers drinking coffee, and Miss Jellyby biting the feather of her pen. "What a strange house," said Ada, when we got upstairs. "How curious of my cousin John Dacey to send us here." "My love," said I, "quite confuses me. I want to understand it, and I can't understand it at all." "What?" asked Ada, with her pretty smile. "All this, my dear," said I. "It must be very good of Mrs. Jellyby to take such pains about a scheme for the benefit of natives, and yet P.P. and the housekeeping." Ada laughed and put her arm about my neck as I stood looking at the fire, and told me I was a quiet, dear, good creature, and had won her heart. "You are so thoughtful, Esther," she said, "and yet so cheerful, and you do so much so unpretendingly. You would make a home out of even this house, my simple darling." She was quite unconscious that she only praised herself, and that it was in the goodness of her own heart that she made so much of me. "May I ask you a question?" said I, when we had sat before the fire a little while. 500, said Ada. "Your cousin, Mr. John Dacey, I owe so much to him. Would you mind describing him to me?" Shaking her golden hair, Ada turned her eyes upon me with such laughing wonder that I was full of wonder, to partly at her beauty, partly at her surprise. "Esther," she cried, "my dear, you want a description of my cousin John Dice, my dear?" "I never saw him, and I never saw him," returned Ada. "Well, to be sure, no, she had never seen him young as she was, When her mama died, she remembered how the tears would come into her eyes when she spoke of him and of the noble generosity of his character, which she had said was to be trusted above all earthly things, and Ada trusted it. Her cousin Jandis had written to her a few months ago a plain, honest letter, Ada said, proposing the arrangement we were now to enter on and telling her that in time that might heal some of the wounds made by the miserable chancery suit. She had replied gratefully accepting his proposal. Richard had received a similar letter and had made a similar response. He had seen Mr. Johnson once, but only once. 5 years ago at Winchester School, he had told Ada, when they were leaning on the screen before the fire where I found them, but he recollected him as a bluff, rosy fellow. This was the utmost description Ada could give me. It set me thinking so that when Ada was asleep, I still remained before the fire, wondering and wondering about Bleak House, and wondering that yesterday morning should seem so long ago. I don't know where my thoughts had wandered when they were recalled. By a tap at the door, I opened it softly and found Miss Jellaby shivering there with a broken candle and a broken candlestick in one hand and an egg cup in the other. "Good night," she said very sulkily. "Good night," said I. "May I come in?" she shortly and unexpectedly asked me in the same sulky way. "Certainly," said I. "Don't wake Miss Clare." She would not sit down, but stood by the fire dipping her inky middle finger in the egg cup, which contained vinegar, and smearing it over the ink stains on her face, frowning the whole time and looking very gloomy. "I wish Africa was dead," she said on a sudden. I was going to remonstrate. "I do," she said. "Don't talk to me, Miss Summerson. I hate it and detest it. It's a beast." I told her she was tired and I was sorry. I put my hand upon her head and touched her forehead and said it was hot now, but would be cool tomorrow. She still stood pouting and frowning at me, but presently put down her egg cup and turned softly towards the bed where Ada lay. "She is very pretty," she said with the same knitted brow and in the same uncivil manner. I assented with a smile. "An orphan, ain't she?" "Yes, but knows a quantity, I suppose. Can dance and play music and sing. She can talk French, I suppose, and do geography and globes and needlework and everything." "No doubt," said I. "I can't," she returned. "I can't do anything hardly except write. I'm always writing for Mar. I wonder you two were not ashamed of yourselves to come in this afternoon and see me able to do nothing else. It was like your ill nature, yet you think yourselves very fine, I dare say." I could see that the poor girl was near crying, and I resumed my chair without speaking and looked at her, I hope as mildly as I felt towards her. "It's disgraceful," she said. "You know it is. The whole house is disgraceful. The children are disgraceful. I'm disgraceful. Pas miserable. And no wonder Priscilla drinks. She's always drinking. It's a great shame and a great story of you if you say you didn't smell her today. It was as bad as a public house waiting at dinner. You knew it was." "My dear, I don't know it," said I. "You do," she said very shortly. "You shan't say you don't. You do." "Oh, my dear," said I, "if you won't let me speak." "You're speaking now. You know you are. Don't tell stories, Miss Summerson." "My dear," said I, "as long as you won't hear me out." "I don't want to hear you out." "Oh yes, I think you do," said I, "because that would be so very unreasonable. I did not know what you tell me, because the servant did not come near me at dinner, but I don't doubt what you tell me, and I'm sorry to hear it. You need to make a merit of that," said she. "No, my dear," said I, "that would be very foolish." She was still standing by the bed and now stooped down, but still with the same discontented face, and kissed Ada. That done, she came softly back and stood by the side of my chair. Her bosom was heaving in a distressful manner that I greatly pitied, but I thought it better not to speak. "I wish I was dead," she broke out. "I wish we were all dead. It would be a great deal better for us." In a moment afterwards, she knelt on the ground at my side, hid her face in my dress, passionately begged my pardon, and wept. I comforted her and would have raised her, but she cried no, no. She wanted to stay there. "You used to teach girls," she said. "If you could only have taught me, I could have learnt from you. I am so very miserable, and I liked you so much." I could not persuade her to sit by me or to do anything but move a ragged stool to where she was kneeling and take that and still hold my dress in the same manner. By degrees the poor tired girl fell asleep, and then I contrived to raise her head so that it should rest on my lap and to cover us both with shawls. The fire went out, and all night long she slumbered thus before the ashy grate. At first I was painfully awake and vainly tried to lose myself with my eyes closed among the scenes of the day. At length, by slow degrees, they became indistinct and mingled. I began to lose the identity of the sleeper resting on me. Now it was Ada, now one of my old reading friends from whom I could not believe I had so recently parted. Now it was the little mad woman, worn out with curtsying and smiling, now someone in authority. At Bleak House Leslie, it was no one, and I was no one. The purblind day was feebly struggling with the fog when I opened my eyes to encounter those of a dirty-faced little spectre fixed upon me. Peepee had scaled his crib and crept down in his bedgown and cap, and was so cold that his teeth were chattering as if he had cut them all. Chapter 5. A morning adventure. Although the morning was raw, and although the fog still seemed heavy, I say seemed, for the windows were so encrusted with dirt that they would have made midsummer sunshine dim. I was sufficiently forewarned of the discomfort within doors at that early hour, and sufficiently curious about London to think it a good idea on the part of Miss Jellyby when she proposed that we should go out for a walk. "Ma won't be down for ever so long," she said, "and then it's a chance if breakfast's ready for an hour afterwards. They dawdle so as to par. He gets what he can and goes to the office. He never has what you would call a regular breakfast. Priscilla leaves him out the loaf and some milk when there is any overnight. Sometimes there isn't any milk, and sometimes the cat drinks it. But I'm afraid you must be tired, Miss Somerset, and perhaps you would rather go to bed." "I am not at all tired, my dear," said I, "and would much prefer to go out if you're sure you would," returned Miss Jellyby. "I'll get my things on." Ada said she would go too, and was soon astir. I made a proposal to Peepee in default of being able to do anything better for him, that he should let me wash him and afterwards lay him down on my bed again. To this he submitted with the best grace possible, staring at me during the whole operation as if he never had been and never could again be so astonished in his life, looking very miserable also certainly, but making no complaint, and going snugly to sleep as soon as it was over. At first I was in two minds about taking such a liberty, but I soon reflected that nobody in the house was likely to notice it. What with the bustle of dispatching Peepee and the bustle of getting myself ready and helping Ada, I was soon quite in a glow. We found Miss Jellyby trying to warm herself at the fire in the writing room, which Priscilla was then lighting with a smutty parlor candlestick, throwing the candle in to make it burn better. Everything was just as we had left it last night, and was evidently intended to remain so. Below stairs the dinner cloth had not been taken away, but had been left ready for breakfast. Crumbs, dust, and waste paper were all over the house. Some pewter pots and a milk can hung on the area railings. The door stood open, and we met the cook round the corner, coming out of a public house, wiping her mouth. She mentioned as she passed us that she had been to see what o'clock it was. But before we met the cook, we met Richard, who was dancing up and down Fabius Inn to warm his feet. He was agreeably surprised to see us stirring so soon, and said he would gladly share our walk. So he took care of Ada and Miss Jellyby, and I went first. I may mention that Miss Jellyby had relapsed into her sulky manner, and that I really should not have thought she liked me much unless she had told me so. "Where would you wish to go?" she asked. "Anywhere, my dear," I replied. "Anywhere's nowhere," said Miss Jellyby, stopping perversely. "Let us go somewhere at any rate," said I. She then walked me on very fast. "I don't care," she said. "Now you are my witness, Miss Somerset. I say I don't care, but if he was to come to our house with his great shining lumpy forehead night after night, till he was as old as Methuselah, I wouldn't have anything to say to him. Such asses as he and Ma make of themselves, my dear," I remonstrated, in allusion to the epithet and the vigorous emphasis Miss Jellyby set upon it. "Your duty as a child." "Oh, don't talk of duty as a child, Miss Summerson. Where's Ma's duty as a parent? All made over to the public in Africa, I suppose. Then let the public in Africa show duty as a child. It's much more their affair than mine. You are shocked, I dare say. Very well, so am I shocked too. So we are both shocked, and there's an end of it." She walked me on faster yet. "But for all that, I say again, he may come and come and come, and I won't have anything to say to him. I can't bear him. If there's any stuff in the world that I hate and detest, it's the stuff he and Mar talk. I wonder the very paving stones opposite our house can have the patience to stay there and be a witness of such inconsistencies and contradictions as all that sounding nonsense. And Mar's management, I could not but understand her to refer to Mr. Quayle, the young gentleman who had appeared after dinner yesterday. I was saved the disagreeable necessity of pursuing the subject by Richard and Ada coming up at a round pace laughing and asking us if we meant to run a race. Thus interrupted, Miss Jellaby became silent and walked moodily on at my side while I admired the long successes and varieties of streets, the quantity of people already going to and fro, the number of vehicles passing and repassing, the busy preparations and the setting forth of shop windows and the sweeping out of shops, and the extraordinary creatures in rags secretly groping among the swept-out rubbish for pins and other refuse. So, cousin, said the cheerful voice of Richard to Ada behind me, we are never going to get out of Chancery. We have come by another way to our place of meeting yesterday, and by the Great Seal. Here's the old lady again. Truly there she was immediately in front of us, curtsying and smiling, and saying with her yesterday's air of patronage the words in John's dice, very happy. I'm sure you are out early, ma'am, said I as she curtsied to me. Yes, I usually walk here early, before the court sits. It's retired. I collect my thoughts here for the business of the day, said the old lady mincingly. The business of the day requires a great deal of thought. Chancery justice is so very difficult to follow. Who's this, Miss Summerson whispered Miss Jellaby, drawing my arm tighter through her own. The little old lady's hearing was remarkably quick. She answered for herself directly, as suitor, my child, at your service. I have the honor to attend court regularly with my documents. Have I the pleasure of addressing another of the youthful parties? And John Dacey, said the old lady, recovering herself with her hat on one side from a very low curtsy. Richard, anxious to atone for his thoughtlessness of yesterday, good-naturedly explained that Miss Jellaby was not connected with the suit. Ah, said the old lady, she does not expect a judgment. She will still grow old, but not so old. Oh dear, no, this is the garden of Lincoln's Inn. I call it my garden. It is quite a bower in the summertime, where the birds sing melodiously. I pass the greater part of the long vacation here in contemplation. You find the long vacation exceedingly long, don't you? We said yes, as she seemed to expect us to say so. When the leaves are falling from the trees, and there are no more flowers in bloom to make up into nosegays for the Lord Chancellor's court, said the old lady, the vacation is fulfilled, and the sixth seal mentioned in the Revelations again prevails. Pray come and see my lodging. It will be a good omen for me. Youth and hope and beauty are very seldom there. It is a long, long time since I had a visit from either. She had taken my hand and leading me and Miss Jellaby away, beckoned Richard and Ada to come to. I did not know how to excuse myself and looked to Richard for aid, as he was half amused and half curious and all in doubt how to get rid of the old lady without offense. She continued to lead us away, and he and Ada continued to follow our strange conductress, informing us all the time, with much smiling condescension, that she lived close by. It was quite true, as it soon appeared. She lived so close by that we had not time to have done humoring her for a few moments before she was at home. Slipping us out at a little side gate, the old lady stopped most unexpectedly in a narrow back street, part of some courts and lanes immediately outside the wall of the inn, and said, "This is my lodging, pray walk up." She had stopped at a shop over which was written Crook Rag and Bottle Warehouse, also in long thin letters, Crook Dealer in Marine Stores. In one part of the window was a picture of a red paper mill at which a cart was unloading a quantity of sacks of old rags. In another was the inscription, "Bones bought." In another, "Kitchen stuff bought." In another, "Old iron bought." In another, "Waste paper bought." In another, "Ladies' and gentlemen's wardrobes bought." Everything seemed to be bought and nothing to be sold there. In all parts of the window were quantities of dirty bottles, blacking bottles, medicine bottles, ginger beer and soda water bottles, pickle bottles, wine bottles, ink bottles. I am reminded by mentioning the latter that the shop had in several little particulars the air of being in a legal neighborhood, and of being as it were a dirty hanger-on and disowned relation of the law. There were a great many ink bottles. There was a little tottering bench of shabby old volumes outside the door labeled law books, all 9d. Some of the inscriptions I have enumerated were written in law hand, like the papers I had seen in Kenyon Carboy's office, and the letters I had so long received from the firm. Among them was one in the same writing, having nothing to do with the business of the shop, but announcing that a respectable man aged 45 wanted engrossing or copying to execute with neatness and dispatch, address to Nemo, care of Mr. Crook. Within there were several second-hand bags, blue and red. Hanging up a little way within the shop door lay heaps of old crackled parchment scrolls and discolored and dog's-eared law papers, I could have fancied that all the rusty keys, of which there must have been hundreds, huddled together as old iron, had once belonged to doors of rooms, or strong chests in lawyers' offices. The litter of rags tumbled partly into and partly out of a one-legged wooden scale, hanging without any counterpoise from a beam, might have been counselors' bands, and gowns torn up. One had only to fancy, as Richard whispered to Adora and me while we all stood looking in, but yonder bones in a corner piled together and picked very clean were the bones of clients, to make the picture complete, as it was still foggy and dark, and as the shop was blinded besides by the wall of Lincoln's Inn intercepting the light within a couple of yards. We should not have seen so much but for a lighted lantern that an old man in spectacles and a hairy cap was carrying about. In the shop, turning towards the door, he now caught sight of us. He was short, cadaverous, and withered, with his head sunk sideways between his shoulders, and the breath issuing in visible smoke from his mouth as if he were on fire within his throat. Chin and eyebrows were so frosted with white hairs, and so gnawed with veins and puckered skin, that he looked from his breast upward like some old root in a fall of snow. I said, "The old man coming to the door, have you anything to sell?" We naturally drew back and glanced at our conductress, who'd been trying to open the house door with a key she had taken from her pocket, and to whom Richard now said that as we had the pleasure of seeing where she lived, we would leave her, being pressed for time. But she was not to be so easily left. She became so fantastically and pressingly earnest in her entreaties that we would walk up and see her apartment for an instant, and was so bent in her harmless way on leading me in, as part of the good omen she desired that I, whatever the others might do, saw nothing for it but to comply. I suppose we were all more or less curious at any rate, when the old man added his persuasions to hers, and said, I please, sir, it won't take a minute. Come in through the shop. If Taverdor's out of order. We all went in, stimulated by Richard's laughing encouragement, and relying on his protection. My landlord Crook, said the little old lady, condescending to him from her lofty station, as she presented him to us. He is called among the neighbors the Lord Chancellor. His shop is called the Court of Chancery. He's a very eccentric person. He is very odd. Oh, I assure you he's very odd. She shook her head a great many times and tapped her forehead with her finger to express to us that we must have the goodness to excuse him, for he is a little, you know, said the old lady with great stateliness. The old man overheard and laughed. It's true enough, he said, going before us with the lantern, but they call me the Lord Chancellor and call my shop Chancery. And why do you think they call me the Lord Chancellor and my shop Chancery? I don't know, I'm sure, said Richard rather carelessly. You see, said the old man, stopping and turning round, here's lovely hair. I've got 3 sacks of ladies' hair below, but none so beautiful and fine as this. What color and what texture! That'll do, my good friend, said Richard, strongly disapproving of his having drawn one of Ada's tresses through his yellow hand. You can admire as the rest of us do, without taking that liberty. The old man darted at him a sudden look which even called my attention from Ada, who, startled and blushing, was so remarkably beautiful that she seemed to fix the wandering attention of the little old lady herself. But as Ada interposed and laughingly said she could only feel proud of such genuine admiration, Mr. Crook shrunk into his former self as suddenly as he had leapt out of it. You see, I have so many things here, he resumed, holding up the lantern, of so many kinds, and all as the neighbors think, but they know nothing, wasting away and going to rack and ruin. That's why they've given me and my place a christening, and I have so many old parchments and papers in my stock, and I have a liking for rust and must and cobwebs and all fish that comes to my net, and I can't bear to part with anything I once lay hold of, or so my neighbors think. But what do they know, or to alter anything, or to have any sweeping, nor scaring, nor cleaning, nor repairing going on about me? That's the way I've got the old name of Chancery. I don't mind. I go to see my noble and learned brother pretty well every day. When he sits in the inn, he don't notice me, but I notice him. There's no great odds betwixt us. We both grub on in a muddle. Lady Jane, a large grey cat, leapt from some neighbouring shelf on his shoulder and startled us all. I show him how your scratch oi tear, my lady, said her master. The cat leapt down and ripped at a bundle of rags with her tigerish claws, with a sound that it set my teeth on edge to hear she'd do as much for anyone I was to set her on, said the old man, idling catskins among other general matters, and hers was offered to me. It's a very fine skin, as you may see, but I didn't have it stripped off. That weren't like chancery practice, though, says you. He had by this time leds across the shop, and now opened a door in the back part of it leading to the house entry. As he stood with his hand upon the lock, the little old lady graciously observed to him before passing out, "That will do, Crook, you mean well, but you are tiresome. My young friends are pressed for time, have none to spare, myself having to attend court very soon. My young friends are the wards and John Dice." "John Dice," said the old man with a start. "John Dice, and John Dice, the great suit crook, returned his lodger," I exclaimed the old man in a tone of thoughtful amazement, and with a wider stare than before. Think of it, he seemed so rapt all in a moment, and looked so curiously at us, that Richard said, "Why, you appear to trouble yourself a good deal about the causes before your noble and learned brother, the other chancellor." "Yes," said the old man abstractedly. "Sure, your name now will be Richard Carstone." "Carstone," he repeated, slowly checking off that name upon his forefinger. "And each of the others," he went on to mention upon a separate finger. "Yes, there was the name of Barbary, and the name of Clare, and the name of Deadlock too. I think he knows as much of the cause as the real salaried chancellor," said Richard, quite astonished to Ader. "And me, why," said the old man, coming slowly out of his abstraction. "Yes, Tom Jandisher, excuse me, being related, but he was never known about court by any other name, and was as well known there as she is now," nodding slightly at his lodger. "Tom Jardis was often in here. He got into a restless habit of strolling about when the calls was on, or expected, talking to the little shopkeepers and telling them to keep out of chancery, whatever they did, for, says he, it's being ground to bits in a slow mill, it's being roasted at a slow fire, it's being stung to death by single bees, it's being drowned by drops, it's going mad by grains." He was as near making away with himself just where the young lady stands, as near as could be. We listened with horror. "He come in at the door," said the old man, slowly pointing an imaginary track along the shop. "On the day he did it, the whole neighborhood had said for months before that he would do it of a certainty sooner or later. He come in at the door that day, and walked along there, and sat himself on a bench that stood there, and asked me, your judge, I was a mortal sight younger than to fetch him a pint of wine, for, says he, Crook, I am much depressed, my cause is on again, and I think I'm nearer judgment than I ever was. I hadn't a mind to leave him alone. Then I persuaded him to go to the tavern over the way there, to other side my lane, I mean Chancery Lane, and I followed and looked in at the window, and saw him comfortable, as I thought, in the armchair by the fire, and company with him. I hadn't hardly got back here when I heard a shot go echoing and rattling right away into the inn. I ran out, neighbors ran out, 20 of us cried at once, Tom John Dice. The old man stopped, looked hard at us, looked down into the lantern, blew the light out, and shut the lantern up. We were right. I needn't tell the present ears, to be sure, how the neighborhood poured into court that afternoon, while the cause was on, how my noble and learned brother and all the rest of them grubbed and muddled away as usual, and tried to look as if they hadn't heard a word of the last fact in the case, or as if they had, oh dear me, nothing at all to do with it. If they had heard of it by any chance, Ada's color had entirely left her, and Richard was scarcely less pale, nor could I wonder, judging even from my emotions. And I was no party in the suit, the heart so untried and fresh, it was a shock to come into the inheritance of a protracted misery, attended in the minds of many people with such dreadful recollections. I had another uneasiness in the application of the painful story to the poor half-witted creature who had brought us there. But to my surprise she seemed perfectly unconscious of that, and only led the way upstairs, again informing us with a toleration of a superior creature for the infirmities of a common mortal that her landlord was a little She lived at the top of the house in a pretty large room from which she had a glimpse of Lincoln's Inn Hall. This seemed to have been her principal inducement originally for taking up her residence. There she could look at it, she said, in the night, especially in the moonshine. Her room was clean, but very, very bare. I noticed the scantiest necessaries in the way of furniture. A few old prints from books of chancellors and barristers wavered against the wall, and some half-dozen reticles and work bags containing documents. As she informed us, there were neither coals nor ashes in the grate, and I saw no articles of clothing anywhere nor any kind of food upon a shelf in an open cupboard were a plate or to a cup or two, and so forth, but all dry and empty. There was a more affecting meaning in her pinched appearance, I thought as I looked round, than I had understood before. Extremely honored, I am sure, said our poor hostess with the greatest suavity, by this visit from the wards and John Dacey, and very much indebted for the omen. It is a retired situation, considering I am limited as to situation and consequence of the necessity of attending on the Chancellor. I have lived here many years. I pass my days in court, my evenings, and my nights here. I find the nights long, for I sleep but little, and think much. That is of course unavoidable, being in Chancery. I am sorry I cannot offer chocolate. I expect a judgment shortly, and shall then place my establishment on a superior footing. At present I don't mind confessing to the wards and Jandis in strict confidence, but I sometimes find it difficult to keep up a genteel appearance. I have felt a cold here. I have felt something sharper than gold. It matters very little. Pray excuse the introduction of such mean topics. She partly drew aside the curtain of the long low garret window and called our attention to a number of bird cages hanging there, some containing several birds. There were larks, linnets, and goldfinches. I should think at least 20. I began to keep the little creatures, she said, with an object that the wards will readily comprehend, with the intention of restoring them to liberty when my judgment should be given. Yes, they die in prison, though their lives, poor silly things, are so short in comparison with Chancery proceedings that one by one the whole collection has died over and over again. I doubt, do you know whether one of these, though they are all young, will live to be free? Very mortifying, is it not? Although she sometimes asked a question, she never seemed to expect a reply, but rambled on as if she were in the habit of doing so when no one but herself was present. Indeed, she pursued, I positively doubt sometimes, I do assure you, whether while matters are still unsettled, and the sixth or great seal still prevails, I may not one day be found lying stark and senseless here, as I have found so many birds. Richard, answering what he saw and Ada's compassionate eyes, took the opportunity of laying some money softly and unobserved on the chimney piece. We all drew nearer to the cages, feigning to examine the birds. I can't allow them to sing much, said the little old lady, for you'll think this curious. I find my mind confused by the idea that they are singing while I am following the arguments in court, and my mind requires to be so very clear. You know, another time I'll tell you their names, not at present, on a day of such good omen. They shall sing as much as they like, in honor of youth a smile and curtsy, hope a smile and curtsy, and beauty a smile and curtsy. There will let in the full light. The birds began to stir and chirp. I cannot admit the air freely, said the little old lady. The room was close, and would have been the better for it, because the cat you saw downstairs, called Lady Jane, is greedy for their lives. She crouches on the parapet outside for hours and hours, I have discovered, whispering mysteriously that her natural cruelty is sharpened by a jealous fear of their regaining their liberty in consequence of the judgment I expect being shortly given. She is sly and full of malice. I have believed sometimes that she is no cat, but the wolf of the old saying. It is so very difficult to keep her from the door. Some neighboring bells reminding the poor soul that it was 9:30 did more for us in the way of bringing our visit to an end than we could easily have done for ourselves. She hurriedly took up her little bag of documents, which she had laid upon the table on coming in, and asked if we were also going into court. On our answering no, and that we would on no account detain her, she opened the door to attend us downstairs. With such an omen, it is even more necessary than usual that I should be there before the Chancellor comes in, said she, for he might mention my case the first thing. I have a presentiment that he will mention it the first thing this morning. She stopped to tell us in a whisper as we were going down that the whole house was filled with strange lumber which her landlord had bought piecemeal and had no wish to sell in consequence of being a little This was on the first floor, but she had made a previous stoppage on the second floor, and had silently pointed at a dark door there. The only other lodger, she now whispered in explanation, a law writer. The children in the lanes here say he has sold himself to the devil. I don't know what he can have done with the money. Hush, she appeared to mistrust that the lodger might hear her even there, and repeating hush went before us on tiptoe, as though even the sound of her footsteps might reveal to him what she had said passing through the shop on our way out. As we had passed through it on our way in, we found the old man storing a quantity of packets of waste paper in a kind of well in the floor. He seemed to be working hard, with a perspiration standing on his forehead, and had a piece of chalk by him, with which as he put each separate package or bundle down he made a crooked mark on the paneling of the wall. Richard and Ada and Miss Jellaby and the little old lady had gone by him, and I was going when he touched me on the arm to stay me, and chalked the letter J upon the wall in a very curious manner, beginning with the end of the letter and shaping it backward. It was a capital letter, not a printed one, but just such a letter as any clerk in Messrs. Kenny and Carboy's office would have made. "Can you read it?" he asked me with a keen glance. "Surely," said I. "It's very plain." "What is it, J?" With another glance at me, and a glance at the door, he rubbed it out and turned an A in its place, not a capital letter this time, and said, "What's that?" I told him. He then rubbed that out and turned the letter R, and asked me the same question. He went on quickly, until he had formed in the same curious manner, beginning at the ends and bottoms of the letters, the word John Dice, without once leaving two letters on the wall together. "What does that spell?" he asked me. When I told him, he laughed in the same odd way, yet with the same rapidity. He then produced singly and rubbed out singly the letters forming the words Bleak House. These in some astonishment I also read, and he laughed again. I said, "The old man laying aside the chalk, I have a turn for copying from memory. You see, miss, though I can neither read nor write, he looked so disagreeable, and his cat looked so wickedly at me, as if I were a blood relation of the birds upstairs, that I was quite relieved by Richard's appearing at the door and saying, 'Miss Summerson, I hope you are not bargaining for the sale of your hair. Don't be tempted. 3 sacks below are quite enough for Mr. Crook.' I lost no time in wishing Mr. Crook good morning and joining my friends outside, where we parted with a little old lady who gave us her blessing with great ceremony, and renewed her assurance of yesterday in reference to her intention of settling estates on Ada and me. Before we finally turned out of those lanes, we looked back and saw Mr. Crook standing at his shop door in his spectacles, looking after us with his cat upon his shoulder and her tail sticking up on one side of his hairy cap like a tall feather. "Quite an adventure for a morning in London," said Richard with a sigh. "Oh, cousin, it's a weary word, this chancery. It is to me, and has been ever since I can remember," returned Ada. "I am grieved that I should be the enemy, as I suppose I am of a great number of relations and others, and that they should be my enemies, as I suppose they are, and that we should all be ruining one another without knowing how or why, and be in constant doubt and discord all our lives. It seems very strange, as there must be right somewhere, but an honest judge in real earnest has not been able to find out through all these years where it is." "Ah, cousin," said Richard, "strange indeed. All this wasteful wanton chess playing is very strange. To see that composed court yesterday jogging on so serenely, and to think of the wretchedness of the pieces on the board, gave me the headache and the heartache. Both together. My head ached with wondering how it happened, if men were neither fools nor rascals, and my heart ached to think they could possibly be either. But at all events, Ada, I may call you Ada, of course, you may, cousin Richard, at all events, Chancery will work none of its bad influences on us. We have happily been brought together thanks to our good kinsman, and it can't divide us now, never, I hope, cousin Richard, said Ada gently. Miss Jellaby gave my arm a squeeze, and me a very significant look. I smiled in return, and we made the rest of the way back very pleasantly. In half an hour after our arrival, Mrs. Jellaby appeared, and in the course of an hour the various things necessary for breakfast straggled one by one into the dining room. I do not doubt that Mrs. Jellaby had gone to bed and got up in the usual manner, but she presented no appearance of having changed her dress. She was greatly occupied during breakfast, for the morning's post brought a heavy correspondence relative to Borrioboola, which would occasion her, she said, to pass a busy day. The children tumbled about and notched memoranda of their accidents in their legs, which were perfect little calendars of distress, and Peepy was lost for an hour and a half and brought home from Newgate Market by a policeman. The equable manner in which Mrs. Jelly sustained both his absence and his restoration to the family circle surprised us all. She was by that time perseveringly dictating to Caddy, and Caddy was fast lapsing into the inky condition in which we had found her at 1 o'clock. An open carriage arrived for us, and a cart for our luggage. Mrs. Jellyby charged us with many reminiscences to her good friend Mr. John Dice. Carrie left her desk to see us depart, kissed me in the passage, and stood biting her pen and sobbing on the steps. Peepee, I'm happy to say, was asleep and spared the pain of separation. I was not without misgivings that he had gone to Newgate Market in search of me and all. The other children got up behind the barouche and fell off, and we saw them with great concern scattered over the surface of Fabi's Inn as we rolled out of its precincts. Chapter 6. Quite at home. The day had brightened very much and still brightened as we went westward. We went our way through the sunshine and the fresh air, wondering more and more at the extent of the streets, the brilliancy of the shops, the great traffic, and the crowds of people whom the pleasanter weather seemed to have brought out like many colored flowers. By and by we began to leave the wonderful city and to proceed through suburbs, which of themselves would have made a pretty large town in my eyes, and at last we got into a real country road again, with windmills, rickards, milestones, farmers' wagons, scents of old hay, swinging signs, and horse troughs, trees, fields, and hedgerows. It was delightful to see the green landscape before us, and the immense metropolis behind, and when a wagon with a train of beautiful horses furnished with red trappings and clear-sounding bells came by us with its music. I believe we could all three have sung to the bells, so cheerful were the influences around the whole road. Has been reminding me of my namesake Whittington, said Richard. And that wagon is the finishing touch. Hello, what's the matter? We had stopped, and the wagon had stopped too. Its music changed as the horses came to a stand and subsided to a gentle tinkling, except when a horse tossed his head or shook himself and sprinkled off a little shower of bell ringing. Our postilion, he is looking after the wagoner, said Richard, and the wagoner is coming back after us. Good day, friend. The wagoner was at our coach door. Why, here's an extraordinary thing, added Richard, looking closely at the man. He has got your name, Ada, in his hat. He had all our names in his hat. Tucked within the band were 3 small notes, one addressed to Ada, one to Richard, one to me. These the wagoner delivered to each of us, respectively. Reading the name aloud first in answer to Richard's inquiry from whom they came, he briefly answered, Master, sir, if you please, and putting on his hat again, which was like a soft bowl, cracked his whip, reawakened his music, and went melodiously away. Is that Mr. John Dice's wagon? Said Richard, calling to our postboy. Yes, sir, he replied, going to London. We opened the notes. Each was a counterpart of the other, and contained these words in a solid, plain hand: I look forward, my dear, to our meeting easily and without constraint on either side. I therefore have to propose that we meet as old friends and take the past for granted. It will be a relief to you possibly, and to me certainly, and so my love to you, John Jardice. I had perhaps less reason to be surprised than either of my companions, having never yet enjoyed an opportunity of thanking one who had been my benefactor and sole earthly dependence through so many years. I had not considered how I could thank him, my gratitude lying deep in my heart for that. But I now began to consider how I could meet him without thanking him, and felt it would be very difficult indeed. The notes revived in Richard and Ada a general impression that they both had, without quite knowing how they came by it, that their cousin Jandis could never bear acknowledgments for any kindness he performed, and that sooner than receive any he would resort to the most singular expedients and evasions, or would even run away. Ada dimly remembered to have heard her mother tell when she was a very little child that he had once done her an act of uncommon generosity, and that on her going to his house to thank him, he happened to see her through a window coming to the door, and immediately escaped by the back gate, and was not heard of for 3 months. This discourse led to a great deal more on the same theme, and indeed it lasted us all day, and we talked of scarcely anything else. If we did by any chance diverge into another subject, we soon returned to this, and wondered what the house would be like, and when we should get there, and whether we should see Mr. John Dice as soon as we arrived or after a delay, and what he would say to us, and what we should say to him, all of which we wondered about over and over again. The roads were very heavy for the horses, but the pathway was generally good, so we alighted and walked up all the hills, and liked it so well that we prolonged our walk on the level ground. When we got to the top at Barnet, there were other horses waiting for us, but as they had only just been fed, we had to wait for them too, and got a long fresh walk over a common and an old battlefield before the carriage came up. These delays so protracted the journey that the short day was spent, and the long night had closed in before we came to St. Albans, near to which town Bleak House was. We knew by that time we were so anxious and nervous that even Richard confessed as we rattled over the stones of the old street to feeling an irrational desire to drive back again. As to Ada and me, whom he had wrapped up with great care, the night being sharp and frosty, we trembled from head to foot when we turned out of the town round a corner, and Richard told us that the postboy, who had for a long time sympathized with our heightened expectation, was looking back and nodding. We both stood up in the carriage, Richard holding Ada lest she should be jolted down, and gazed round upon the open country and the starlight night for our destination. There was a light sparkling on the top of a hill before us, and the driver, pointing to it with his whip and crying, "That's Bleak House," put his horses into a canter and took us forward at such a rate uphill, though it was that the wheels sent the road drift flying about our heads like spray from a water mill. Presently we lost the light, presently saw it, presently lost it, presently saw it, and turned into an avenue of trees, and cantered up towards where it was beaming brightly. It was in a window of what seemed to be an old-fashioned house, with 3 peaks in the roof in front, and a circular sweep leading to the porch. A bell was rung as we drew up, and amidst the sound of its deep voice in the still air, and the distant barking of some dogs, and a gush of light from the open door, and the smoking and steaming of the heated horses, and the quickened beating of our own hearts, we alighted in no inconsiderable confusion. "Ada, my love." "Esther, my dear, you are welcome. I rejoice to see you." "Rick, if I had a hand to spare at present, I would give it to you." The gentleman who said these words in a clear, bright, hospitable voice had one of his arms round Ada's waist and the other round mine, and kissed us both in a fatherly way, and bore us across the hall into a ruddy little room all in a glow with a blazing fire. Here he kissed us again, and opening his arms made us sit down side by side on a sofa ready drawn out near the hearth. I felt that if we had been at all demonstrative, he would have run away in a moment. "Now, Rick," said he, "I have a hand at liberty. A word in earnest is as good as a speech. I am heartily glad to see you. You are at home. Warm yourself." Richard shook him by both hands with an intuitive mixture of respect and frankness, and only saying, though with an earnestness that rather alarmed me, "I was so afraid of Mr. John Dacey's suddenly disappearing." "You are very kind, sir. We are very much obliged to you." Laid aside his hat and coat and came up to the fire. "And how did you like the ride? And how did you like Mrs. Jellyby, my dear?" said Mr. Jarndyce to Ada, while Ada was speaking to him. In reply I glanced, I need not say with how much interest, at his face. It was a handsome, lively, quick face, full of change and motion, and his hair was a silvered iron gray. I took him to be nearer 60 than 50, but he was upright, hearty, and robust from the moment of his first speaking to us. His voice had connected itself with an association in my mind that I could not define, but now all at once a something sudden in his manner and a pleasant expression in his eyes recalled the gentleman in the stage-coach 6 years ago on the memorable day of my journey to Reading. I was certain it was he. I never was so frightened in my life as when I made the discovery, for he caught my glance, and appearing to read my thoughts, gave such a look at the door that I thought we had lost him. However, I am happy to say he remained where he was and asked me what I thought of Mrs. Jellyby. "She exerts herself very much for Africa, sir," I said nobly, returned Mr. Jarndyce. "But you answer like Ada, whom I had not heard. You all think something else, I see." "We rather thought," said I, glancing at Richard and Ada, who entreated me with their eyes to speak, "that perhaps she was a little unmindful of her home." "Flawed," cried Mr. Jarndyce. I was rather alarmed again. "Well, I want to know your real thoughts, my dear. I may have sent you there on purpose." "We thought that perhaps," said I, hesitating, "it is right to begin with the obligations of home, sir, and that perhaps while those are overlooked and neglected, no other duties can possibly be substituted for them." "The little Jellybys," said Richard, coming to my relief, "are really, I can't help expressing myself strongly, sir, in a devil of a state." "She means well," said Mr. Jarndyce hastily. "The wind's in the east." "It was in the north, sir, as we came down," observed Richard. "My dear Rick," said Mr. Jarndyce, poking the fire, "I'll take an oath it's either in the east or going to be. I am always conscious of an uncomfortable sensation now and then when the wind is blowing in the east." "Rheumatism, sir," said Richard. "I dare say it is, Rick. I believe it is. And so the little gel, I had my doubts about him. Arena, oh Lord, yes, it's Easterly, said Mr. Jardice. He had taken 2 or 3 undecided turns up and down while uttering these broken sentences, retaining the poker in one hand and rubbing his hair with the other with a good-natured vexation at once so whimsical and so lovable that I'm sure we were more delighted with him than we could possibly have expressed in any words he gave. An arm to Ada and an arm to me, and bidding Richard bring a candle was leading the way out when he suddenly turned us all back again. Those little jellies, couldn't you? But didn't you now if it had rained sugar plums or 3-cornered raspberry tarts or anything of that sort, said Mr. Jardice. So Cousin Ada hastily began. Good, my pretty pet, I like Cousin John. Perhaps is better than Cousin John. Ada laughingly began again. Ha ha, very good indeed, said Mr. Jardice, with great enjoyment. Sounds uncommonly natural. Yes, my dear, it did better than that it rained. Esther, eh? said Mr. Jardice. What did Esther do? Why, Cousin John, said Ada, clasping her hands upon his arm and shaking her head at me across him, for I wanted her to be quiet. Esther was their friend directly. Esther nursed them, coaxed them to sleep, washed and dressed them, told them stories, kept them quiet, bought them keepsakes. My dear girl, I had only gone out with Peepy after he was found and given him a little tiny horse, and Cousin John, she softened poor Carolyn, the eldest one, so much, and was so thoughtful for me, and so amiable. No, I won't be contradicted, Esther dear. You know, it's true. The warm-hearted darling leaned across her Cousin John and kissed me, and then looking up in his face boldly said, at all events, Cousin John, I will thank you for the companion you have given me. I felt as if she challenged him to run away, but he didn't. Where did you say the wind was, Rick asked Mr. Jardice. In the north as we came down, sir. You are right, there's no east in it. A mistake of mine. Come, girls, come and see your home. It was one of those delightfully irregular houses where you go up and down steps out of one room into another, and where you come upon more rooms when you think you have seen all there are, and where there is a bountiful provision of little halls and passages, and where you find still older cottage rooms in unexpected places with lattice windows and green growth pressing through them. Mine, which we entered first, was of this kind, with an up and down roof that had more corners in it than I ever counted afterwards, and a chimney. There was a wood fire on the hearth, paved all around with pure white tiles, in every one of which a bright miniature of the fire was blazing out of this room. You went down 2 steps into a charming little sitting room looking down upon a flower garden, which room was henceforth to belong to Ada and me. Out of this you went up 3 steps into Ada's bedroom, which had a fine broad window commanding a beautiful view. We saw a great expanse of darkness lying underneath the stars, to which there was a hollow window seat, in which with a spring lock 3 dear Adas might have been lost. At once out of this room you passed into a little gallery, with which the other best rooms only to communicated, and so by a little staircase of shallow steps with a number of corner stairs in it, considering its length, down into the hall. But if instead of going out at Ada's door, you came back into my room and went out of the door by which you had entered it, and turned up a few crooked steps that branched off in an unexpected manner from the stairs, you lost yourself in passages with mangles in them, and 3-cornered tables, and a native Hindu chair, which was also a sofa, a box, and a bedstead, and looked in every form something between a bamboo skeleton and a great bird cage, and had been brought from India, nobody knew by whom or when. From these you came on Richard's room, which was part library, part sitting room, part bedroom, and seemed indeed a comfortable compound of many rooms. Out of that you went straight, with a little interval of passage, to the plain room, where Mr. John Dale slept all the year round, with his window open, his bedstead without any furniture standing in the middle of the floor for more air, and his cold bath gaping for him in a smaller room adjoining. Out of that you came into another passage where there were back stairs, and where you could hear the horses being rubbed down outside the stable, and being told to hold up and get over as they slipped about very much on the uneven stones, or you might if you came out at another door. Every room had at least 2 doors, go straight down to the hall again by 6 steps, and a low archway, wondering how you got back there, or had ever got out of it. The furniture old-fashioned rather than old, like the house was as pleasantly irregular. Ada's sleeping room was all flowers and chintz and paper in velvet and needlework, and the brigade of 2 stiff courtly chairs which stood each attended by a little page of a stool for great estate on either side of the fireplace. Our sitting room was green, and had framed and glazed upon the walls numbers of surprising and surprised birds staring out of pictures at a real trout in a case as brown and shining as if it had been served with gravy at the death of Captain Cook, and of the whole process of preparing tea in China, as depicted by Chinese artists. In my room, there were oval engravings of the month's ladies haymaking in short waists, and large hats tied under the chin for June smooth-legged noblemen pointing with cocked hats to village steeples. For October half-length portraits and crayons abounded all through the house, but were so dispersed that I found the brother of a youthful officer of mine in the china closet, and the gray old age of my pretty young bride with a flower in her bodice in the breakfast room as substitutes, had for angels of Queen Anne's reign, taking a complacent gentleman to heaven in festoons with some difficulty, and a composition and needlework representing fruit a kettle, and an alphabet. All the movables from the wardrobes to the chairs and tables, hangings, glasses, even to the pin cushions and scent bottles on the dressing tables displayed the same quaint variety. They agreed in nothing but their perfect neatness, their display of the whitest linen, and their storing up, wherever the existence of a drawer small or large rendered it possible, of quantities of rose leaves and sweet lavender, such with its illuminated windows softened here and there by shadows of curtains shining out upon the starlight night, with its light and warmth and comfort, with its hospitable jingle at a distance of preparations for dinner, with the face of its generous master brightening everything we saw, and just wind enough without to sound a low accompaniment to everything we heard, were our first impressions of Bleak House. "I am glad you like it," said Mr. Jarndyce, when he had brought us round again to Ada's sitting room. "It makes no pretensions, but it is a comfortable little place, I hope, and will be more so with such bright young looks in it. You have barely half an hour before dinner. There's no one here but the finest creature upon earth, a child." "More children, Esther," said Ada. "I don't mean literally a child," pursued Mr. Jarndyce. "Not a child in years. He is grown up. He is at least as old as I am, but in simplicity and freshness and enthusiasm, and a fine guileless inaptitude for all worldly affairs. He is a perfect child." We felt that he must be very interesting. "He knows Mrs. Jellyby," said Mr. Jarndyce. "He is a musical man, an amateur, but might have been a professional. He is an artist to an amateur, but might have been a professional. He is a man of attainments and of captivating manners. He has been unfortunate in his affairs, and unfortunate in his pursuits, and unfortunate in his family. But he don't care. He's a child." "Did you imply that he has children of his own, sir?" inquired Richard. "Yes, Rick, half a dozen more, nearer a dozen, I should think, but he has never looked after them." "How could he? He wanted somebody to look after him." "He is a child, you know," said Mr. Jarndyce. "And have the children looked after themselves at all, sir?" inquired Richard. "Why, just as you may suppose," said Mr. Jarndyce's countenance suddenly falling. "It is said that the children of the very poor are not brought up, but dragged up. Harold Skimpole's children have tumbled up somehow or other. The wind's getting round again. I am afraid I feel it rather." Richard observed that the situation was exposed on a sharp night. "It is exposed," said Mr. Jarndyce. "No doubt that's the cause. Bleak House has an exposed sound. But you're coming my way. Come along." Our luggage having arrived, and being all at hand, I was dressed in a few minutes, and engaged in putting my worldly goods away, when a maid, not the one in attendance upon Ada, but another whom I had not seen, brought a basket into my room, with 2 bunches of keys in it, all labeled "For you, miss, if you please." Said she. "For me," said I. "The housekeeping case, miss." I showed my surprise, for she added with some little surprise on her own part, "I was told to bring them as soon as you was alone, Miss Summerson, if I don't deceive myself." "Yes," said I, "that is my name. The large bunch is the housekeeping, and the little bunch is the cellars, miss. Any time you was pleased to appoint. Tomorrow morning I was to show you the presses and things they belong to." I said I would be ready at 6:30, and after she was gone stood looking at the basket, quite lost in the magnitude of my trust. Ada found me thus, and had such a delightful confidence in me when I showed her the keys and told her about them. But it would have been insensibility and ingratitude not to feel encouraged. I knew, to be sure, that it was the dear girl's kindness, but I liked to be so pleasantly cheated. When we went downstairs, we were presented to Mr. Skimpole, who was standing before the fire telling Richard how fond he used to Be in his school time of football, he was a bright little creature with a rather large head, but a delicate face and a sweet voice. And there was a perfect charm in him. All he said was so free from effort and spontaneous, and was said with such a captivating gaiety, that it was fascinating to hear him talk. Being of a more slender figure than Mr. John Dice, and having a richer complexion, with browner hair, he looked younger. Indeed, he had more the appearance in all respects of a damaged young man than a well-preserved elderly one. There was an easy negligence in his manner, and even in his dress, his hair carelessly disposed, and his neckerchief loose and flowing, as I have seen artists paint their own portraits, which I could not separate from the idea of a romantic youth who had undergone some unique process of depreciation. It struck me as being not at all like the manner or appearance of a man who had advanced in life by the usual road of years, cares, and experiences. I gathered from the conversation that Mr. Skimp had been educated for the medical profession, and had once lived in his professional capacity in the household of a German prince. He told us, however, that as he had always been a mere child in point of weights and measures, and had never known anything about them except that they disgusted him, he had never been able to prescribe with the requisite accuracy of detail. In fact, he said he had no head for detail, and he told us with great humor that when he was wanted to bleed the prince or physic any of his people, he was generally found lying on his back in bed reading the newspapers or making fancy sketches in pencil, and couldn't come the prince at last objecting to this, in which, said Mr. Skimp in the frankest manner, he was perfectly right. The engagement terminated, and Mr. Skimpo, having, as he added with delightful gaiety, nothing to live upon but love, fell in love and married, and surrounded himself with rosy cheeks. His good friend Jandis and some other of his good friends then helped him in quicker or slower succession to several openings in life, but to no purpose, for he must confess to two of the oldest infirmities in the world. One was that he had no idea of time, the other that he had no idea of money, in consequence of which he never kept an appointment, never could transact any business, and never knew the value of anything. So he had got on in life, and here he was very fond of reading the papers, very fond of making fancy sketches with a pencil, very fond of nature, very fond of art. All he asked of society was to let him live. That wasn't much. His wants were few. Give him the papers, conversation, music, mutton, coffee, landscape, fruit in the season, a few sheets of Bristol board, and a little claret, and he asked no more. He was a mere child in the world, but he didn't cry for the moon. He said to the world, go your several ways in peace. Wear red coats, blue coats, long put pens behind your ears, wear aprons, go after glory, holiness, commerce, trade, any object you prefer, only let Harold Skimpole live. All this and a great deal more he told us, not only with the utmost brilliancy and enjoyment, but with a certain vivacious candor, speaking of himself as if he were not at all his own affair, as if Skimley were a third person, as if he knew that Skimley had his singularities, but still had his claims to which were the general business of the community, and must not be slighted. He was quite enchanting. If I felt at all confused at that early time in endeavoring to reconcile anything he said with anything I had thought about the duties and accountabilities of life, which I am far from sure of, I was confused by not exactly understanding why he was free of them. That he was free of them, I scarcely doubt it. He was so very clear about it himself. I covered nothing, said Mr. Skimpole in the same light way. Possession is nothing to me. Here is my friend John Dice's excellent house. I feel obliged to him for possessing it. I can sketch it and alter it. I can set it to music. When I am here, I have sufficient possession of it, and have neither trouble, cost, nor responsibility. My steward's name, in short, is John Dice, and he can't cheat me. We have been mentioning Mrs. Jellyby. There is a bright-eyed woman of a strong will and immense power of business detail, who throws herself into objects with surprising ardor. I don't regret that I have not a strong will and an immense power of business detail to throw myself into objects with surprising ardor. I can admire her without envy. I can sympathize with the objects. I can dream of them. I can lie down on the grass in fine weather and float along an African river, embracing all the natives I meet, as sensible of the deep silence, and sketching the dense, overhanging tropical growth as accurately as if I were there. I don't know that it's of any direct use, my doing so, but it's all I can do, and I do it thoroughly. Then, thy heaven's sake, having Harold Skimpole, a confiding child, petitioning you, the world, an agglomeration of practical people of business habits, to let him live and admire the human family do it somehow or other like good souls, and suffer him to ride his rocking horse. It was plain enough that Mr. Jardice had not been neglectful of the adulation. Mr. Skimpo's general position there would have rendered it so, without the addition of what he presently said. It's only you, the generous creatures, whom I envy, said Mr. Skimpo, addressing us as new friends in an impersonal manner. I envy you your power of doing what you do. It is what I should revel in myself. I don't feel any vulgar gratitude, do you? I almost feel as if you ought to be grateful to me for giving you the opportunity of enjoying the luxury of generosity. I know you like it. For anything I can tell, I may have come into the world expressly for the purpose of increasing your stock of happiness. I may have been born to be a benefactor to you, by sometimes giving you an opportunity of assisting me in my little perplexities. Why should I regret my incapacity for details and worldly affairs when it leads to such pleasant consequences? I don't regret it, therefore, of all his playful speeches, playful, yet always fully meaning what they expressed. None seemed to be more to the taste of Mr. John Dacey than this. I had often new temptations afterwards to wonder whether it was really singular or only singular to me that he, who was probably the most grateful of mankind upon the least occasion, should so desire to escape the gratitude of others. We were all enchanted. I felt it a merited tribute to the engaging qualities of Ada and Richard that Mr. Skimpole, seeing them for the first time, should be so unreserved and should lay himself out to be so exquisitely agreeable. They, and especially Richard, were naturally pleased for similar reasons, and considered it no common privilege to be so freely confided in by such an attractive man. The more we listened, the more gaily Mr. Skimpole talked, and what with his fine hilarious manner, and his engaging candor, and his genial way of lightly tossing his own weaknesses about as if he had said, I am a child, you know, you are designing people compared with me. He really made me consider myself in that light. But I am gay and innocent. Forget your worldly arts and play with me. The effect was absolutely dazzling. He was so full of feeling too, and had such a delicate sentiment for what was beautiful or tender, that he could have won a heart by that alone. In the evening, when I was preparing to make tea and Ada was touching the piano in the adjoining room and softly humming a tune to her cousin Richard, which they had happened to mention, he came and sat down on the sofa near me, and so spoke of Ada that I almost loved him. She is like the morning, he said, with that golden hair, those blue eyes, and that fresh bloom on her cheek. She is like the summer morning. The birds here will mistake her for it. We will not call such a lovely young creature as that, who is a joy to all mankind, an orphan. She is the child of the universe. Mr. John Dacey, I found, was standing near us, with his hands behind him and an attentive smile upon his face. The universe, he observed, makes rather an indifferent parent. I am afraid, oh, I don't know, cried Mr. Skimpole buoyantly. I think I do know, said Mr. Jardice. Well, cried Mr. Skimpo, you know the world, which in your sense is the universe, and I know nothing of it, so you shall have your way. But if I had mine, glancing at the cousins, there should be no brambles of sordid realities in such a path as that. It should be strewn with roses. It should lie through bowers where there was no spring, autumn, nor winter, but perpetual summer. Age or change should never wither it. The base word money should never be breathed near it. Mr. Jardice patted him on the head with a smile, as if he had been really a child, and passing a step or two on, and stopping a moment, glanced at the young cousins. His look was thoughtful, but had a benignant expression in it which I often, how often, saw again, which has long been engraved on my heart. The room in which they were communicating with that in which he stood was only lighted by the fire. Ada sat at the piano. Richard stood beside her, bending down upon the wall. Their shadows blended together, surrounded by strange forms, not without a ghostly motion, caught from the unsteady fire, though reflecting from motionless objects. Ada touched the note so softly and sang so low that the wind sighing away to the distant hills was as audible as the music. The mystery of the future and the little clue afforded to it by the voice of the present seemed expressed in the whole picture. But it is not to recall this fancy well as I remember it, but I recall the scene first. I was not quite unconscious of the contrast in respect of meaning and intention between the silent look directed that way and the flow of words that had preceded it. Secondly, though Mr. John Dacey's glance, as he withdrew it, rested for but a moment on me, I felt as if in that moment he confided to me and knew that he confided to me, and that I received the confidence as hope that Ada and Richard might one day enter on a dearer relationship. Mr. Skimpole could play on the piano and the violoncello, and he was a composer. Had composed half an opera once, but got tired of it and played what he composed with taste. After tea, we had quite a little concert in which Richard, who was enthralled by Ada's singing, and told me that she seemed to know all the songs that ever were written, and Mr. John Dyson and I were the audience. After a little while I missed first Mr. Skimpole and afterwards Richard, and while I was thinking how could Richard stay away so long and lose so much, the maid who had given me the keys looked in at the door saying, "If you please, miss, could you spare a minute?" When I was shut out with her in the hall, she said, holding up her hands, "Oh, if you please, miss, Mr. Carlstone says, would you come upstairs to Mr. Skimpole's room? He has been took." Mistook said I took Miss Sudden, said the maid. I was apprehensive that his illness might be of a dangerous kind, but of course I begged her to be quiet and not disturb anyone, and collected myself as I followed her quickly upstairs, sufficiently to consider what were the best remedies to be applied if it should prove to be a fit. She threw open a door, and I went into a chamber where, to my unspeakable surprise, instead of finding Mr. Skimp stretched upon the bed or prostrate on the floor, I found him standing before the fire smiling at Richard, while Richard, with a face of great embarrassment, looked at a person on the sofa in a white greatcoat with smooth hair upon his head, and not much of it, but he was wiping smoother and making less of with a pocket handkerchief. "Miss Summerson," said Richard hurriedly, "I am glad you are come. You will be able to advise us. Our friend Mr. Skimpole, don't be alarmed, is arrested for debt, and really, my dear Miss Summerson," said Mr. Skimp with his agreeable candor, "I never was in a situation in which that excellent sense and quiet habit of method and usefulness, which anybody must observe in you who has the happiness of being a quarter of an hour in your society, was more needed." The person on the sofa, who appeared to have a cold in his head, gave such a very loud snort that he startled me. "Are you arrested for much, sir?" I inquired of Mr. Skimp. "My dear Miss Summerson," said he, shaking his head pleasantly, "I don't know, some pounds, odd shillings, and halfpence I think were mentioned. It's 20 for pounds 16 and 7 pence, hattily observed the stranger. "That's what it is, and it sounds somehow, it sounds," said Mr. Skimpole, "like a small sum." The strange man said nothing but made another snort. It was such a powerful one that it seemed quite to lift him out of his seat. Mr. Skimpole said, "Richard to me has a delicacy in applying to my cousin John Dice, because he has lately, I think, sir, I understood that you had lately." "Oh yes," returned Mr. Skimpole, smiling, "though I forget how much it was, and when it was Jandis would readily do it again. But I have the epicure-like feeling that I would prefer a novelty, and help that I would rather," and he looked at Richard and me, "develop generosity in a new soil and in a new form of flower. What do you think will be best, Miss Summerson?" said Richard. Aside, I ventured to inquire generally, before replying, what would happen if the money were not produced. "Joe," said the strange man coolly, putting his handkerchief into his hat, which was on the floor at his feet, "or Coevans's." "May I ask, sir, what is Go Evans's?" said the strange man. "A house." Richard and I looked at one another again. It was a most singular thing that the arrest was our embarrassment, and not Mr. Skimp's. He observed us with a genial interest, but there seemed, if I may venture on such a contradiction, nothing selfish in it. He had entirely washed his hands of the difficulty, and it had become ours. I thought he suggested, as if good-naturedly, to help us out, that being parties in a chancery suit concerning, as people say, a large amount of property, Mr. Richard, or his beautiful cousin, or both, could sign something, or make over something, or give some sort of undertaking, or pledge, or bond. I don't know what the business name of it may be, but I suppose there is some instrument within their power that would settle this. "Not a bit on it," said the strange man. "Really," returned Mr. Skimpole, "that seems odd now to one who is no judge of these things." "Odd or even," said the stranger gruffly, "I tell you, not a bit on it. Keep your temper, my good fellow, keep your temper." Mr. Skimpole gently reasoned with him as he made a little drawing of his head on the flyleaf of a book. "Don't be ruffled by your occupation. We can separate you from your office. We can separate the individual from the pursuit. We are not so prejudiced as to suppose that in private life you are otherwise than a very estimable man. With a great deal of poetry in your nature of which you may not be conscious, the stranger only answered with another violent snort, whether in acceptance of the poetry tribute or in disdainful rejection of it. He did not express to me now, my dear Miss Somerset, and my dear Mr. Richard, said Mr. Skimpole gaily, innocently, and confidingly, as he looked at his drawing, with his head on one side. Here you see me utterly incapable of helping myself, and entirely in your hands. I only ask to be free. The butterflies are free. Mankind will surely not deny to Harold Skimpole what it concedes to the butterflies. My dear Miss Summerson, said Richard in a whisper, I have £10 that I received from Mr. Kanji. Must try what that will do. I possessed £15 odd shillings, which I had saved from my quarterly allowance during several years. I had always thought that some accident might happen, which would throw me suddenly, without any relation or any property on the world, and had always tried to keep some little money by me that I might not be quite penniless. I told Richard of my having this little store, and having no present need of it, and I asked him delicately to inform Mr. Skimpole while I should be gone to fetch it, that we would have the pleasure of paying his debt when I came back. Mr. Skimpole kissed my hand and seemed quite touched. Not on his own account, I was again aware of that perplexing and extraordinary contradiction, but on ours, as if personal considerations were impossible with him, and the contemplation of our happiness alone affected him. Richard begging me for the greater grace of the transaction, as he said, to settle with coevances, as Mr. Skimpole now jocularly called him, I counted out the money and received the necessary acknowledgment.